Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going a long way east, to a narrow blue channel of water where two continents almost touch, and to a city that stood on its western shore for 11 centuries and called itself, to the very last morning, Roman. This is the story of the empire we now call Byzantium, though no one who lived inside it would have understood the word. They said Rome. They meant Rome, and in a stubborn way they were right. For when the western half of the Roman world came apart in the 5th century, its eastern half did not fall with it. It carried on for another 1,000 years, keeping the law and the learning and the faith of the ancient world alight behind a ring of stone, while wave after wave broke against it. Persians came, and Arabs, and Bulgars. Crusaders came, wearing the cross. Turks came at the end. And for 1,100 years the answer was the same. The walls held, the city endured, the empire went on. Until 1453, when the walls came down at last. We will follow the whole of it tonight, from the first stones laid by Constantine the Great to the last emperor who vanished into the breach with a sword in his hand. And then something quieter. What became of the memory afterward, carried west in the arms of scholars, claimed by kings who wanted its inheritance, lingering ever since as the ghost of Rome and the mother of the modern world? There is no hurry in any of this. The events are already finished, and have been finished for a very long time. To understand the empire, you have to begin with the city, and to understand the city, you have to begin with the ground it stood on. Because this was not a place that men happened to settle. It was one of the great strategic positions on the face of the earth, and it shaped the fate of everything built there for 2,000 years. Picture it from a great height, in the dark. A narrow strait called the Bosphorus, a seam of water dividing Europe from Asia, so slender that a shout might cross it. At its southern end it opens into the Sea of Marmara, and from there the water runs on toward the Mediterranean and every harbour of the ancient world. So the great sea road passes here, and so does the great land road from Europe into Asia, because armies marching east must find a crossing, and this is where the crossing is. Two roads, one of water and one of earth, laid across each other. The city sat exactly on the knot. The Greeks saw it first, 1,000 years before the Romans came. Tradition tells us colonists from Megara raised a town on the headland, the hill a visitor today still calls the Acropolis, in the 7th century before Christ, and named it after their leader, Byzas. And an old story has clung to the place ever since. Byzas, before sailing, asked the oracle at Delphi where he should build, and the oracle answered, "Opposite the land of the blind." He sailed, and found on the Asian shore a settlement whose founders had looked across the water at that headland, with its deep, sheltered inlet and its command of the strait, and had chosen the other bank instead. "There," said Byzas, "are the blind," and he built on the hill facing them. It is a legend, tidied into shape by later generations who already knew how the story turned out. But it holds something true. The worth of that ground was plain to anyone who looked, and everyone who looked wanted it. Byzantium grew through the Greek centuries and the Roman centuries as a town of fishermen and merchants, prosperous in a modest way and endlessly fought over. Athenians held it, Spartans took it, Persians and Macedonians came and went. It changed hands the way a coin changes hands. And it was this old town, ancient already, worn smooth by 700 years of other people's ambitions, that the first Christian emperor of Rome chose in the 4th century as the seat of a new capital. Of all the choices he ever made, that one made the empire. His name was Constantine. He had come up through the wreckage of the civil wars that followed Diocletian's abdication, and in the year 312, he won Rome itself at the Milvian Bridge, where, so the account that reached us says, he fought under the sign of the cross, having seen or dreamed a promise of victory in it. Whether he was a man who converted the Roman world to Christianity, or a man whom Christianity converted, historians still debate and cannot settle from the evidence that survives, because the evidence is thin and every witness had a reason to shape it. What is certain is the outcome. A persecuted sect, whose members had been dying in the arenas within living memory, became the favoured faith of the emperor, and then the faith of the empire. In the year 324, he defeated Licinius, his last rival, and stood alone as master of the Roman world. It was then that he decided to build himself a new city. Rome by that point was a beautiful irrelevance, the seat of a pagan aristocracy and an old religion, honoured, expensive, and largely abandoned by emperors who spent their lives on the Rhine and the Danube, and governed from frontier towns like Trier and Milan and Nika. Constantine wanted a capital that was his own, Christian from its first stone, facing east toward the older and wealthier half of the empire. He chose Byzantium. The consecration came, by tradition, in the year 330. The world would call it the city of Constantine, Constantinople, and it would give its name and its life to an empire for the next 1100 years. The world that city was born into explains almost everything about the empire that grew from it. The Rome Constantine inherited was not the Rome of Augustus. It had passed through the catastrophe of the 3rd century, invasion after invasion, usurper after usurper, an empire that came within a breath of ceasing to exist, and Diocletian had rebuilt it into something harder and more rigid. He split the rule into 4, the Tetrarchy, so that no frontier stood unwatched. He reorganized the army and the machinery of administration, and he raised the emperor from first citizen into something closer to a sacred monarch, remote, ceremonial, approached with lowered eyes. Onto that new monarchy, Constantine grafted a new faith. Through the 4th century, the Church of the Martyrs became the established church of the state, its bishops advisors, its councils affairs of empire. And the two things fused. The absolute sacred ruler and the Christian God, the palace and the altar, bound together into a single conception of order that would define the Eastern world for a millennium. So the city rose at the meeting place of the continents, holding the sea road from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and the land road from Europe into Asia. Every merchant convoy passed beneath it. Every army moving between the halves of the world crossed where it stood. Whoever held it held the approaches to the richest provinces on earth. But it was not only rich, it was defensible, and that was the greater gift. The city sat on a blunt triangular peninsula, water on 2 sides, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and to the north that deep, curving inlet the Greeks named the Golden Horn, the finest natural harbour in that part of the world. Only one side faced land. Only one side would ever need a wall. And in time the walls came, land walls and sea walls together, until by the testimony of everyone who saw them, it was simply understood that this was the most defensible city on earth. The site the Greeks had chosen and the Romans adopted was the site that made survival possible. It is why, when everything else was lost, this one place could still be held. What Constantine laid down with that city was not only a capital, it was an arrangement of the world, and the arrangement outlasted him by 1,000 years. 3 things held it together, and they are worth naming slowly, because everything that follows rests on them. The first was the autocrat. Diocletian had already begun the work, splitting rule among 4 men and lifting the emperor out of ordinary life. Constantine reunited the empire and carried the transformation to its end. What emerged was a single sovereign who was master of the state and the army, master of the law, and something close to master of the church. A man whose will simply was the law, surrounded by silence and ceremony. The second was the faith. In the year 325, Constantine summoned the bishops to Nicaea, across the water in Asia, to settle what Christians were required to believe, and in doing so, he set a pattern that would never be broken. Emperors calling councils, emperors troubled by doctrine, the throne and the altar leaning on one another like two hands pressed together. The church became the partner of the palace, and the thing that bound a diverse empire into one body. And the third was the law, the great inheritance of the Roman jurists, centuries of accumulated reasoning about property and marriage and debt and inheritance, carried east intact into the new capital. The empire would keep it, refine it, copy it out again and again by candlelight, and hand it forward at the very end to a Europe that had half forgotten it existed. Autocrat, church, and law. That was the order the new city was built to hold, and through every disaster of the 11 centuries to come, through invasions and heresies and revolutions in the palace, that shape endured. The 100 years after the founding were the years in which the Eastern Empire became itself, and they were not quiet years. The House of Constantine spent the middle decades of the 4th century quarrelling, his sons dividing the inheritance and turning on one another, the theological disputes running alongside the civil wars, each faction certain God stood behind it. Then came his nephew Julian, who had been raised Christian and privately fell in love with the old gods instead, and who used his brief reign to try to turn the whole world back toward the temples. He got nowhere. He died in the year 363, cut down on campaign against the Persians in the Far East, in the manner the sources record, and the old religion died with his ambitions. The dynasty that followed shaped everything. Theodosius the Great ruled the whole Roman world from 379 to 395, the last man ever to hold both halves in one pair of hands. He came to power in the shadow of catastrophe, for in 378 the Roman army had been destroyed at Adrianople, an entire field force broken by the Goths within a few days' march of the capital, and he spent his reign patching what that battle had torn. In his final years, he made Christianity not merely favoured, but the official religion of the state. And at his death in 395, he divided the empire between his two sons, the east to Arcadius, the west to Honorius. It was meant as an administrative convenience. It became permanent. Through the 5th century, the Western Empire came apart piece by piece into Germanic hands, province by province, until there was nothing left to inherit, while the East, holding the wealthy provinces of Syria and Egypt and Asia Minor, and holding above all the great city on the strait, went on breathing. Why one half died and the other lived is a question historians still turn over, and the answers are many. Better revenues, shorter frontiers, luckier emperors, and a capital that could not be taken. But the survival of the East is the moment the Byzantine Empire truly begins. And the greatest work of that age, the work that defined the city for a millennium, was the building of the walls. The old wall of Constantine had been outgrown. The city had simply spilled past it, the way a rising tide fills a shallow bowl. So in the years around 413, under the Emperor Theodosius II, a new line was thrown across the neck of the peninsula, running from the Sea of Marmara all the way north to the Golden Horn, sealing the only landward approach. A visitor can still walk beside them today. They were built in 3 layers, one behind another. First, a moat, wide and deep, that could be flooded. Then a low outer wall behind it. Then, rising above everything, the great inner rampart, with its 96 towers, so tall that men standing on it looked down on an approaching army as though from a cliff. An attacker who crossed the moat found a wall. Who took the wall found a terrace under fire from the towers, with a second, higher wall still ahead. The age regarded these fortifications as the strongest in the world, and the age was right. Remember the walls of Theodosius. They are the first anchor of this story, and we will come back to them again and again through the sieges of Avars and Persians, of Arabs and Bulgars, of Rus and Turks. For 1,000 years they held, and on one morning in April, at the very end, they did not. The emperor who built them is worth knowing. Theodosius II came to the throne in 408 as a small boy and reigned for nearly half a century, a ruler of the palace rather than the camp, governing through his ministers and, most of all, through his formidable sister, the Empress Pulcheria, who had taken a public vow of virginity and turned the imperial household into something between a court and a monastery. He was remembered as a man of books and piety rather than of the sword. His enemies called him mild and meant it unkindly. Yet the achievements of that quiet reign outlasted a great many conquests. In 425, he founded a university in the capital for the teaching of Greek and Latin learning. In 438, he published the Theodosian Code, gathering every law issued since the age of Constantine into a single ordered collection that became the foundation of the empire's legal life. And he built the walls: laws, learning, and stone, the three things a civilization needs if it intends to last. Then, in the year 447, the earth moved. An earthquake struck the city and threw down a long stretch of the new fortifications. Towers cracked open, whole sections collapsed into rubble. And it happened at the worst possible moment, for Attila and the Huns were marching on the empire, and the capital had just lost its shield. What followed became one of the celebrated feats of the age. The government threw the work open to the circus factions, the blues and the greens, those fiercely organized crowds who lived to scream at one another across the racetrack. And they built. Rival mobs, side by side, hauling stone in a race against the horizon. In a matter of weeks, the walls stood whole again. When the Huns came within sight of the city, they looked at what was waiting for them, and they turned aside. Behind that stone, in the decades that followed, lay the greatest city in the world, and it is worth stepping inside it for a while. The Constantinople of the 5th century astonished everyone who saw it, and the wonder still comes through the sources when you read them. Perhaps 500,000 people lived there. The ancient numbers are never firm, and historians hedge them carefully, but nothing else in the Mediterranean came close. The grain fleets of Egypt came up the Marmara to feed it. The trade of 3 continents unloaded on its wharves along the Golden Horn, amber from the north, silk brought overland from places no one there could name, spices, timber, saltfish, slaves. There were palaces and colonnaded forums, and churches everywhere, their doorways breathing incense into the street. And at the centre of its public life stood the Hippodrome, the vast racing arena beside the palace, where the chariot teams ran and the city came undone. The factions we last met hauling stone were, in ordinary times, something closer to a passion and a plague. The blues and the greens, with their own colours, their own chants, their own street gangs and quarrels and theology, roaring at one another across the sand. Emperors did not merely tolerate them. Emperors had to manage them, appear before them, listen to them. It was the nearest thing the autocracy had to a voice of the people, and it was as dangerous as it sounds. Into that secure and gilded world came the first great terror. The Huns, horsemen out of the steppe who had crashed into the Roman world a century before, were gathered in the 440s under a single leader, Attila, whom the age called the Scourge of God. The Eastern Empire had been paying them to stay away. Now it faced the full weight of their power, and the Balkans were harrowed, city after city, while embassies went back and forth across the Danube carrying gold. One of those envoys left us something precious. A Greek named Priscus travelled to the encampment of Attila and wrote down what he saw, and his account survives in fragments that still feel oddly intimate. The wooden halls, the drinking, the flattering poets, and Attila himself eating plain food from a plain wooden plate while everyone around him dined off silver. The terror of the world, quietly refusing luxury. The East paid and bought its peace. The West could not pay and was ravaged. In the end, Attila turned his armies against Italy and Gaul, and then died in the year 453 on the night of his wedding, according to the account that has come down to us, in his sleep, without a wound on him. His empire fell apart within a few seasons. The East, having survived him by the simple expedient of writing checks, turned to face the next thing. That next thing was not an army. It was a question, and it did more damage than the Huns. Since Nicaea, theologians had been arguing about how the divine and the human were joined in Christ. It sounds now like an abstraction that could be set aside. It was not. It touched what salvation meant, and men would die for it. Two great traditions had formed. Alexandria in Egypt pressed the divine nature, the oneness. Antioch in Syria pressed the human, the distinction. Council after council failed to hold them together. In the year 451, the Emperor Marcian summoned the bishops to Chalcedon, on the Asian shore just across the water from the capital, and a formula was decreed. Two natures, divine and human, united in one person, without confusion, without division. Rome accepted it, the Latin West accepted it, and the great churches of the East refused. Egypt refused, much of Syria refused, and Armenia after them. The Coptic Church and its allies held that the definition had divided what could not be divided, and they did not yield. Not under persuasion, not under pressure, not for centuries. The schism opened at Chalcedon never healed. Hold that in mind, because it will come due. 200 years later, when Arab armies rode into Egypt and Syria, they found provinces that had been governed for generations by a capital that considered their faith an error. How much that alienation explains the astonishing speed of those conquests, historians still debate. There were taxes and exhaustion and plague in the story too. But few doubt it counted for something. An empire had won a doctrinal argument and lost its southern half in the process. While the East argued, the West was ending. It had been coming apart for 100 years, province by province, until, in the conventional account, the last Western emperor, a boy called Romulus Augustulus, a child holding two of the greatest names in Roman history and no power at all, was deposed in the year 476 by the Germanic general Odoacer. And Odoacer did something more eloquent than any battle. He gathered the imperial insignia of the West, the robes and the diadem, and shipped them across the sea to Constantinople, to the Emperor Zeno, with the message that the West no longer required an emperor of its own. Nobody at the time thought the world had ended. There was still an emperor. He simply lived in the East now. But from that moment, there was only one Rome left standing, and it stood on the Bosphorus. The last decades of that century show how it intended to survive, not by force, which it could not afford, but by a patient, cold-blooded diplomacy the empire raised to an art. Zeno had a difficulty. An Ostrogothic king named Theodoric, dangerous, ambitious, and camped uncomfortably close to the capital with an army behind him. Zeno's answer was to point him westward. "Go to Italy," he said in effect. "Odoacer holds it, take it from him." Theodoric went, fought a long campaign, killed Odoacer with his own hand at a banquet, and made himself king of Italy, a kingdom that stood for a generation and, by Theodoric's own lights, still belonged to the Roman order. The empire had removed a threat from its doorstep and gained a distant, plausible deputy, all with a suggestion. Not every problem yielded so neatly. The Isaurians, mountain people from southern Anatolia, had risen high in imperial service. Zeno himself came from among them, which is part of why the court despised him. When the favour turned, the fighting was long and bitter, and it took the reign of Anastasius to subdue them. Anastasius, who ruled to the year 518, is one of the empire's underrated men, a careful administrator with a talent for money, who reformed the coinage, abolished a hated tax on trade, and still contrived to leave the treasury with an enormous reserve of gold. Tribute, treaty, war, and thrift. Those were the instruments, and by them the Eastern Empire came through the century that killed its twin. And that full treasury, sitting in the vaults of the great palace, was about to pay for the most ambitious reign in Byzantine history. He came to the throne in the year 527, and he did not intend to be a caretaker. Justinian was the nephew of a soldier. His uncle Justin had come out of the Balkan hill country as a peasant recruit, walked to the capital with bread in a bag, risen through the guard by sheer competence, and ended up wearing the diadem, a man who, if the gossip of the age is to be believed, could barely write his own name. Whatever Justin lacked, he made sure his nephew had. He brought the boy to the city, had him educated in law and letters and the machinery of government, and left him the empire. What Justin passed on then was a full treasury, an unusually well-trained heir, and a state that had spent a century learning to survive. Justinian took all of it and turned it toward a single idea: that the Roman Empire was not something to be defended, but something to be restored. For 38 years, he pursued that idea with a relentlessness that exhausted everyone around him. He was said to sleep very little. His officials called him, not entirely fondly, the emperor who never slept. He did not rule alone. Beside him sat Theodora, and no woman of the ancient world is harder to see clearly. The historian Procopius, who wrote the official histories of the reign and then privately wrote a second, venomous account that survives as the secret history, tells us she had been a performer on the stage before her marriage, a profession then somewhere between actress and something far less respectable. And he says a great deal more besides, most of it designed to wound. Set the scandal aside, and the outline remains. An intelligent, formidable, politically ruthless woman who held real power, protected her allies, pressed her own religious sympathies against her husband's policy, and in the great crisis of the reign proved the harder of the two. Every source, hostile or admiring, was obliged to reckon with her. The crisis came in 532, and it nearly ended everything. It began, as so much did, in the Hippodrome. The Blues and the Greens, who had spent decades being managed by emperors, this time made common cause against one, angered by taxation, by two officials they loathed, by an execution mishandled, and their shared cry became the name of the rising: Nika, conquer, victory. It ran out of the stands and into the streets, and the streets burned. Churches went up, and palaces, and much of the ceremonial heart of the city. The crowd proclaimed a rival emperor. Justinian, besieged in the palace with a handful of loyal men, had ships readied at the private harbour and prepared to run. Theodora would not go. The speech the sources preserve may be tidied, may be half-invented, such speeches usually are, but its final line has never lost its edge. She said that if he wished to save himself, there was the sea, there were the ships, let him go. But that for her part she would stay, because the imperial purple made a fine burial shroud. He stayed. And then the generals moved. Belisarius and Narcissus shut the crowd inside the racing arena and put it to the sword, and the killing that followed was on a scale that silenced the city for years. The throne was saved at a cost nobody wrote down honestly, but the fires had cleared ground, and Justinian was a man who saw opportunity in ash. Among the buildings destroyed was the great church of the capital, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia. He resolved to rebuild it, and not as it had been. He gave the work to two men who were not builders by trade but geometers, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians who approached the problem as an exercise in the properties of curves and forces. What they produced, consecrated in the year 537, was the greatest building of the ancient world, and arguably the boldest. They set an enormous shallow dome over a square hall, carried on pendentives that gathered its weight down into 4 piers, and pierced its base with a ring of windows, so that in the morning the light comes through in a continuous band, and the whole immense roof appears to rest on nothing at all. Contemporaries said it seemed suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Inside, acres of gold mosaic, marble quarried across the empire and cut so that its veining opened like the wings of moths, and a space so large that the far end softens into haze. Tradition says that when Justinian first entered the finished church, he thought of the temple in Jerusalem and said aloud that he had surpassed Solomon. Whether he said it or not, the building would remain the emblem of the city and the empire, through the sieges, through the fall, and through everything after. The third great work of the reign was quieter, and it changed more. Beginning in 529, Justinian set a commission of jurists under a brilliant and famously corruptible lawyer named Tribonian to do something no one had managed: to take the whole vast, contradictory inheritance of Roman law, 1,000 years of imperial edicts and juristic commentary, much of it obsolete, much of it in conflict with itself, and reduce it to order. They produced 4 things: the Code, gathering the surviving laws of the emperors; the Digest, distilling the writings of the great jurists into a single reasoned body; the Institutes, a textbook for students; and the Novels, the new legislation of the reign, issued in Greek because that was now the language people actually spoke. He presented it as a restoration. It was, in truth, an act of preservation. And it worked. The Eastern Empire lived by that law for the rest of its existence. And in the 11th century, when scholars in Italy rediscovered the Digest and began to teach it at Bologna, the reasoning of dead Roman lawyers came back into a Europe that had been getting by on custom and memory, and grew, over the centuries, into the civil law of most of the world. Of everything Justinian did, that is the piece still standing. Which brings us to the man who carried out the rest of it, Belisarius, the general of the Reconquest. He was Balkan-born like his emperor, and he rose the same way Justin had, through the wars. By his 30s, he was commanding the armies of the empire. Before he was finished, he had fought Persians in the east, saved the throne in the Hippodrome, taken Africa, taken Italy, and been recalled, distrusted, and sent out again more times than any man should tolerate. Procopius rode with him and wrote it all down, which is why we can still follow those campaigns almost day by day. And it is worth noticing, before the triumphs begin, that Belisarius belongs to the decline as much as to the height. In the bad years afterward, when the treasury was empty and the armies broken, and something terrible was coming up the road, the emperors kept turning to the same aging man, and he kept going. His first war was the oldest one the empire had. Persia had been there since before there was a Rome in the east at all. The one rival that was not a tribe or a warband, but a state, with its own king of kings, its own bureaucracy, its own ancient religion, and armies as good as anything the empire could put in the field. In the year 531, a new king took that throne, Khosrow I, who would rule for nearly half a century and become, in Persian memory, the model of a just sovereign. He and Justinian were contemporaries and mirrors, and they spent their reigns circling one another. The wars ran on the eastern frontier through all the years of the Reconquest. Belisarius and the other generals manoeuvring across the dry country of Mesopotamia, sieges laid against frontier fortresses, cities taken and ransomed and taken again. Neither side could finish it. In the middle of the reign, the two powers made peace on terms the empire could live with and did not enjoy. Constantinople would pay in gold annually, and Persia would keep the peace. That arrangement tells you something honest about the limits of Byzantine power. The empire could not defeat Persia, and it could not walk away from Persia, and so it bought quiet with money it needed elsewhere. The same war, against the same rival, would go on being fought by the same two states for another 100 years, until both of them had nothing left. The gold to pay for all this came from trade, and the city was built to collect it. Everything moving between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea passed the sea walls. Everything moving overland between Europe and Asia crossed at the strait. The empire exported its own abundance: grain, wine, oil, textiles, the fine work of its craftsmen, and imported the luxuries of the further east: spices and gems coming up through the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and above all, silk. Silk was the empire's expensive humiliation. It came overland from China, through Persian hands, and the middlemen set whatever price they liked, so that the Roman treasury was in effect subsidizing its enemy every time the court dressed itself. Then, according to the accounts that have come down to us, Justinian solved it. Monks who had travelled in the east were persuaded to go back and return with silkworm eggs, smuggled out, the story says, concealed inside hollow walking canes. Whether the tale is exact hardly matters. What is certain is that within a generation, the empire had its own mulberry groves and its own worms, and silk weaving became an imperial monopoly that would clothe the court and enrich the state for the rest of its existence. That is the reign as its own age advertised it: victory, law, the great church, the wealth of the world coming ashore. There is another account, and it is worth knowing about. Procopius, who had ridden with Belisarius and written the official histories of the wars and the buildings, also wrote a book he did not publish. It surfaced centuries later, and we call it the Secret History. In it, the emperor is not a restorer, but a demon in human shape, a figure who was seen at night walking the palace without a head. The empress is a monster dragged up from the stage. The reign itself is the ruin of the world. Historians who have weighed it read it as a mixture of genuine grievance and pure malice, the private rage of a man who had spent his life writing praise. But it has permanently complicated the picture, and perhaps that is fair. It is the age of glory and the age of darkness in the same 40 years, and no one has ever fully reconciled them. The great enterprise, meanwhile, was the reconquest of the West. In 534, Belisarius took Africa from the Vandals, in a campaign of stunning speed: a landing, 2 battles, and 100 years of Vandal rule simply gone, with the treasure of Carthage paraded through the hippodrome. Then Italy, which was supposed to be the same, and was not. The war against the Ostrogoths dragged on for 20 years. Rome itself changed hands repeatedly, besieged, starved, emptied. Its aqueducts were cut, its senate dissolved into nothing, its population fell to a fraction. Narses finished what Belisarius began, and by the end the peninsula was imperial again, and wrecked. Parts of southern Spain were taken too, and for a moment, on a map, the Mediterranean was a Roman lake once more. It was exactly what Justinian had set out to achieve. It was also, in the judgment of most historians who have looked at what came after, more than the empire could carry. The treasury that Anastasius had filled was empty. The manpower was spent. The recovered provinces were poorer than the cost of holding them, and there were no reserves left for the frontiers that actually mattered. And then, in 541, something came ashore at the Egyptian port of Pelusium that no army could stop. The physicians of the age described the symptoms carefully: the fever, the swellings at the groin and the armpit, the delirium, and modern scholars reading those descriptions identify it as bubonic plague, the same disease that would return to the world 8 centuries later as the Black Death. It moved the way trade moved, along the grain routes, into the ports, up the rivers. It reached the capital in the spring of 542 and stayed for months. Procopius, who was there, says the dead outpaced any means of burying them, that the towers of the Galata fortifications across the water were filled with corpses and roofed over, and that the city fell silent. All its business stopped, everyone waiting. Justinian himself caught it, and, by the accounts that survive, recovered, which very few did. What did not recover was the empire. How many died, no one can say. The ancient numbers are unreliable, and the modern estimates range enormously. But the shape is not in doubt. Fields went unworked. Taxes went uncollected. Recruits could not be found. It came back in waves for 2 centuries afterward, each return knocking down whatever had grown since the last. So the reign that had begun with the promise of a restored Roman world ended with a world too thin to hold what had been won. Justinian died in 565, in his 80s, still working. His successors inherited the conquests, the debts, the empty villages, and the war with Persia. And within a lifetime, almost all of the reconquest would be lost again. One last thing from that age deserves a mention, because you can still walk through it. The city stood on a peninsula with no river. Everything it drank had to be carried in, and the engineering that made a capital of 500,000 people possible on that dry headland was as remarkable as anything above ground. Water came from the hills far to the west, along the aqueduct of Valens, whose great double arcade still strides across a busy road in Istanbul today, traffic pouring beneath it. And it was stored underground, in vast covered cisterns, against siege and drought. The greatest of them is the Basilica cistern, built in this reign beneath a public square near the great church. Descend the steps now, and you come into a cool, dim, echoing hall the size of a cathedral. Its roof held up by a forest of hundreds of columns, many of them second-hand, scavenged from older temples, including 2 enormous carved heads of Medusa set on their sides and upside down at the base of 2 pillars, for reasons nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. Water drips. The columns stand in their own reflections and go on into the dark, further than the eye follows. They built it to survive a siege. Within a century, that was exactly what the city would need. The 45 years between the death of Justinian in 565 and the year 610 are the years in which the empire came apart at the seams, and they are worth following closely, because what emerged at the other end was no longer a late Roman state at all. It was something new. The crisis made the Middle Ages out of antiquity. Justinian's successors inherited the bill. Justin II, his nephew, refused to keep paying Persia and reopened the war the empire could not afford. The strain broke him, and the sources describe an emperor sliding into madness, carried through the palace in a wheeled chair, having to be distracted like a child. Tiberius came next, and was remembered as a kind man in a season with no room for kindness. Generous with money the treasury did not have. Then Maurice, who ruled from 582 to 602 and deserved better than he got. He was one of the ablest men to hold the throne. He reorganized the army, tightened the administration, wrote or commissioned a hard-headed military manual that survives to this day, fought the Persians to a favorable settlement, and held the Danube against the Avars, steppe horsemen in the mold of the Huns, and against the Slavic peoples steadily filtering south into the Balkans. And he was careful with money, which killed him. In the autumn of 602, he ordered the army to winter beyond the Danube rather than come home, to save the cost of supply. The army mutinied, marched on the capital, and raised a junior officer named Phocas to the throne. Maurice was executed with his sons. The 8 years that followed were among the worst the empire ever inflicted on itself. Phocas ruled by terror, and lasted only as long as fear held, a reign of executions, purges, and revolts, while the frontiers dissolved behind him. And Persia, watching, understood that the moment had come. Deliverance arrived by sea. The governor of Africa in Carthage sent his son with a fleet, and in the year 610, Heraclius sailed into the Golden Horn with icons of the Virgin fixed to his masts. The city opened to him. Phocas was dragged before him, and the new emperor took the throne. He inherited a catastrophe. Khosrow II of Persia, who had been sheltered by Maurice years before and now claimed to be avenging him, had used the chaos to do what no Persian king had ever managed: not raiding, conquering. The eastern provinces fell one after another: Syria, then Palestine, then Egypt itself, the granary that fed the capital. In 614, the Persians took Jerusalem and carried away the most sacred object in the Christian world, the relic of the true cross, north into Persia as a trophy. By the early 620s, the empire of the Romans had been reduced to Anatolia, scraps of the Balkans, and the city. On a map, it looked finished. And then came 626, the year the walls earned everything ever spent on them. The Persians came up to the Asian shore, close enough to see the domes across the water. The Avars and their Slavic subjects came down from the north with an enormous host and closed on the land walls. Two enemies, both banks, the city between them, and the emperor was not there. Heraclius was 1,000 miles away and refused to return. What held the city was three things: the walls, which the Avars could not break; the imperial fleet, which controlled the water and prevented the two armies from ever joining, sinking the Slavic canoes in the Golden Horn; and the patriarch Sergius, who had the icon of the Virgin carried in procession along the ramparts while the population prayed. When the siege broke and the Avars withdrew, the city was certain of what had saved it. The great hymn sung in thanksgiving that year is still sung in the Orthodox churches, and from that time the city belonged, in its own understanding, to the Mother of God. It was not merely defensible, it was defended. Meanwhile, Heraclius was doing the most audacious thing any Byzantine emperor ever attempted. From 622, he had taken the field himself, the first emperor to campaign in person in generations. And instead of trying to push the Persians back out of Syria province by province, he ignored the lost provinces entirely. He took his army by sea to the north, into the mountains of Armenia and the Caucasus, made allies of the Turkic peoples of the steppe, and struck at Persia from above, into its own heartland, cutting behind everything Khosrow held. He melted down church plate to pay for it. He drilled his troops through winters in the mountains. And in the end, he brought Khosrow's forces to battle near the ruins of Nineveh in 627 and destroyed them. The Persian king fled, was overthrown by his own nobles, and was killed. The empire that followed sued for peace on Byzantine terms, withdrawal from every conquered province, and the return of the cross. In the year 630, Heraclius carried the true cross back into Jerusalem himself. Tradition says he entered on foot, in plain clothes, having been told that the gate would not admit a man in imperial gold. 20 years of ruin had been reversed. It was the greatest triumph the empire ever celebrated, and it was, in the judgment of historians, the last great victory of the ancient world. It bought 6 years, because while the two old empires had been tearing one another to pieces, something had begun in a place neither of them thought about. In the towns of Western Arabia, through the same decades, the Prophet Muhammad had been preaching a new faith, the oneness of God, submission to him, a community bound by revelation rather than by tribe. By the time he died in 632, most of the peninsula had come under that community's authority, and the leadership passed to his successors, the caliphs. The Arab armies that came north out of Arabia in the years after 632 met two exhausted giants. Persia had just been broken by Heraclius. The Roman East had just been recovered by an army that had marched for a decade, and a treasury that had been emptied to pay for it, over provinces still resentful after Chalcedon, and still remembering that the empire had abandoned them once already. In the year 636, the imperial field army met the Arabs at the Yarmouk, a river gorge in the hills south of Damascus. The fighting lasted days. A dust storm out of the desert blew into Roman faces at the decisive moment, and when it ended, the army of the East had ceased to exist. Syria was gone. Palestine followed, and Jerusalem, recovered 6 years earlier with such joy, surrendered, this time for good. Egypt fell next, in a campaign of a few seasons, the richest province the empire had, the source of the grain fleets that fed the capital, lost and never regained. Heraclius, old and ill and by some accounts terrified of crossing water, watched it all from Constantinople. The story goes that as he left Syria for the last time, he turned back toward the country he was abandoning and said farewell to it, a long farewell, knowing what it meant. He had saved the empire, and then lived to see 2/3 of it taken by an enemy nobody had heard of when his reign began. What was left after that was a different country, wearing an old name. Consider what the losses actually meant. For 7 centuries this had been a Mediterranean empire, its wealth drawn from Egypt and Syria, its cities strung along the warm southern rim of the sea from Alexandria to Antioch. In the space of a single decade, that entire southern half was gone, and with it the granary that had fed the capital since Constantine, and the tax revenues on which everything ran. What remained was Anatolia, a rugged upland with a hostile frontier across its middle, some coastline and islands, a foothold in Italy, and the city. So the empire ceased to be Mediterranean and became something narrower and harder, a fortress state facing east, defined from then on by the border with Islam. Everything that follows, the wars, the raids, the theology, the sense of being a chosen people under siege, comes out of that one displacement. For the remaining 8 centuries, the Byzantines would be the frontier of the Christian world, and they would know it. Nor could they even hold their own church together. The argument opened at Chalcedon had never closed, and emperor after emperor tried to close it, always the same way, by inventing a formula vague enough for both sides to sign. Zeno had issued the Henoticon in the year 482, an instrument of union that carefully avoided saying whether the council had been right. Rome rejected it and broke communion for decades. The Eastern churches were unimpressed. Later emperors tried again with new formulas and new councils, and each attempt brought a few years of quiet and left the divisions exactly where they had been. Then the provinces those compromises had been designed to keep were lost anyway, and the whole exhausting effort became irrelevant overnight. It is a hard lesson about the limits of power. The autocrat could command armies and appoint patriarchs, and still not make men believe the same thing. What the crisis did produce was a reinvention of the state, and it was brilliant, and it was born of pure necessity. The late Roman way of war was to pay professional soldiers from tax revenue. That required a large tax base, and the tax base had just been amputated. So through the 7th century, the empire rebuilt its defences on a different principle. The surviving provinces were reorganized into military districts called themes. The name seems to have begun as a word for a body of troops, and then attached itself to the ground they occupied. Soldiers were settled on the land of their theme, with holdings of their own, and in exchange for that land, they and their sons owed service. A general commanded each theme and governed it too. Civil and military authority welded together in a way the old Roman system had deliberately kept apart. The results were profound. An army that lived where it fought did not need to be paid much. could not easily be disbanded, and had every reason to defend its own fields. When Arab raiders came over the passes, the men who rode out to meet them were defending the farm their children were standing in. The empire lost its ability to project power outward, and gained an extraordinary ability to absorb punishment, which was precisely the trade it needed. The theme system carried Byzantium through its darkest centuries, and formed the basis of its later revival. While the eastern frontier hardened, the Balkans slipped away almost quietly. The Slavs had been coming south across the Danube since the 6th century, at first in raids, then in migrations, then simply as people who lived there now. There was no great invasion to record, no decisive battle, only the steady arrival of village after village into a countryside emptied by plague and stripped of troops sent east. By the end of the 7th century, imperial authority in the interior of the Balkans had thinned to almost nothing. Greek-speaking life clung to the coasts and the walled towns, and behind them lay a Slavic landscape. The empire responded, as it always did when it could not fight. It recognized what it could not prevent, made treaties, took tribute, and waited. And then, patiently, over generations, it did the thing it was best at. It sent priests and letters and craftsmen. It baptized chieftains. It dazzled visiting princes with ceremony. The peoples who had taken the Balkans, Serbs, Croats, Bulgars later, and the rest, became in time Christian peoples of the Eastern Rite, writing in an alphabet the empire's missionaries would design for them, building churches modelled on Byzantine churches, looking to Constantinople as the centre of the world. The empire lost the provinces and won the souls, and the second turned out to last far longer than the first. The Orthodox Balkans exist because of that slow, patient work, and they exist still. And there was one more thing that saved them, and it is the strangest item in the whole imperial arsenal. Sometime in the 7th century, tradition credits a Syrian refugee named Kallinikos, who fled the Arab conquests and brought the secret with him to the capital. Byzantine engineers developed an incendiary weapon that could be sprayed from a ship. They pumped it under pressure through bronze tubes mounted in the bows, and it came out as a jet of liquid flame that stuck to whatever it touched and went on burning on the surface of the sea. Water spread it. Enemy crews learned that jumping overboard did not help. Its enemies called it the fire of the Romans. History calls it Greek fire. The empire treated the formula as a state secret of the highest order. The sources describe its effects in loving detail and never once give the recipe. And an emperor, writing a manual for his own son, told him that the secret had been delivered by an angel and must never leave the city. It never did. It was lost so completely that no one has recovered it. Modern scholars, working from the descriptions, believe it was based on refined petroleum from the seeps around the Black Sea, thickened with resins and heated in a sealed apparatus so it emerged already under pressure. But the mixture, and above all the engineering of the pump, died with the men who knew it. For 400 years no enemy fleet could face it. Arab navies, Russ longboats, Italian galleys all learned the same lesson in the same way. Twice it saved the city outright. Of all the secrets of Byzantine survival, this is the one that most reads like a legend, and it is entirely real. The walls, the fleet, the themes, and the fire. That was what the empire had left when the armies of the caliphs came up the length of Anatolia and stood at last on the shore opposite the city, looking across at the domes, and began to build. They came twice, and both times everything hung on that one line of stone. These are the second great anchor of our story. The first attempt ran from 674 to 678, in the reign of Constantine IV. The Arabs had taken the sea lanes and the nearby coasts, and they settled in for a blockade, coming up each campaigning season, wintering at a base along the Marmara, wearing the city down by patience. It was the caliphate at the height of its momentum, and there was no reason to think the outcome would differ from Syria or Egypt. It differed because of the fire. The imperial fleet came out and burned theirs on the water, again and again, and there was nothing the Arab captains could do about it. After 4 years they withdrew, and their retreating fleet was scattered by storms on the way home. The empire, which had been losing for 40 years, had won something. The second siege, from 717 to 718, was the graver of the two, and the emperor who met it was Leo III, a soldier from the Anatolian frontier who had seized the throne months before with the enemy already marching. This time the Arabs came with everything: an enormous army across the land walls, a great fleet to close the sea, and the intention of ending the matter for good. What defeated them was the fire again, and then the winter, an exceptionally hard one, snow lying for weeks, the besieging camp starving among its own dead animals. Disease went through them. Their Christian crews defected. A Bulgar army came down from the north and fell on their rear, killing thousands. When the survivors sailed away in the summer of 718, only a fraction of that vast expedition ever saw home. Historians have long argued over how much turned on those walls in that year, and the argument tends to run large. What is not in dispute is that the tide of the first great expansion of Islam broke there, and did not rise that far again for 700 years. The war between the empire and the caliphate would go on for centuries, raid and counter-raid across the Anatolian passes, but it settled into a frontier rather than a conquest. The city held. The empire became the shield of the Christian world, and knew itself as such. And then, having survived, it turned on itself over the question of pictures. Leo III, the same man who had just saved the city, came to believe that the veneration of holy images was precisely what the commandments forbade: idolatry, worship given to wood and paint. Some think the disaster of the previous century had convinced him that God was punishing the empire for it, and that the Arabs' austere refusal of images was part of why they kept winning. In the year 726, he ordered the icons removed, and the story goes that when soldiers came to take down the great image of Christ above the palace gate, a crowd of women killed the officer with their bare hands. That set the shape of the next century. On one side, the iconoclasts, the breakers of images, led by emperors and much of the army. On the other, the iconodules, the servants of images, monks above all, and the ordinary faithful, and the women of the empire, who defended the icons with a ferocity that surprised everyone. It was not a squabble about decoration. It went to whether the divine could be represented in matter at all, and therefore to what the incarnation had meant. Monasteries were closed, and monks were beaten and blinded. The theologians who argued for the images did their best work in exile, out of imperial reach. The councils settled it twice. In 787, the Empress Irene, a formidable and ruthless woman who ruled first for her son and then, after having him blinded, in her own name as sole emperor, the first woman ever to do so, summoned a council at Nicaea that restored the images and drew the crucial distinction. The honor given to an icon passes to the one it depicts. You venerate the image and worship only God. That settlement held for a generation before soldier emperors revived iconoclasm in the 9th century. The end came in the year 843, under another empress acting for a young son, another Theodora. The icons were restored for the last time, and the Church has celebrated that day ever since as the Feast of Orthodoxy, carrying the images in procession each year on the first Sunday of Lent, in memory of a controversy most of the celebrants could no longer explain. The cost had been heavy. A century of internal division in the middle of a war for survival. A great deal of earlier religious art destroyed, which is why so little Byzantine painting from before this period survives. And a deepening estrangement from Rome, which had never accepted the policy and had begun looking elsewhere for a protector. But the outcome shaped everything after. The icon became, permanently, the central act of Orthodox devotion, not a picture of a holy thing, but a window onto it. and Byzantine art turned toward that austere, gold-ground, deliberately unearthly style that everyone now recognizes at a glance. Step back and look at the empire in those long, dark centuries, and you can see what it had become. It was smaller, poorer, and tougher. The great cities of antiquity had shrunk to fortified hilltops. The coinage circulated less. Literacy narrowed to the church and the palace. In place of the old world stood the themes and their soldier farmers, and a free peasantry that was the foundation of both the army and the tax rolls. It lived by the rhythm of the campaigning season, raids over the passes each spring, a retreat to the strongholds, the burning of the harvest, the ransom of captives. And it lived by the rhythm of the liturgy, the processions winding through the capital, the great feasts, the endless intercession of a people who believed themselves defended by heaven and behaved accordingly. This was the world in which the empire of the Middle Ages was made. No longer the late Roman state, not yet the Golden Age to come, but the thing that made the Golden Age possible. While it was fighting for its life, though, it lost something in the West that it never got back. On Christmas Day of the year 800, in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on the head of the Frankish king Charlemagne and hailed him as Emperor of the Romans. In Rome, the act had a certain logic. The papacy needed a protector, the Franks had provided one, and, this was the argument that made it possible, the throne in Constantinople was at that moment occupied by Irene, a woman, which to Western eyes meant it was vacant. In Constantinople, it was theft. There was one Roman Empire, and it had one emperor, and he lived on the Bosphorus. Everything the court believed about its place in the order of the world rested on that. Now there was a barbarian king in the West wearing the title, blessed by a bishop who had no authority to give it away. The empire eventually swallowed a compromise, granting Charlemagne's successors the vaguer style of Emperor of the Franks, while keeping Emperor of the Romans for itself. But something had broken. Two Christendoms now existed, each with its own emperor, each drifting from the other in language and rite and habit of mind. And the long estrangement that would end in schism, and then in something far worse, began with a crown placed on a Frankish head, while its owner, so he later claimed, had no idea it was coming. Two claimants to one title, and neither able to unsay the other. The rulers in the East refused for centuries to grant the Westerners the Roman name. The Westerners went on wearing it and calling the Greeks of Constantinople an Eastern curiosity. The rivalry hardened into habit, and habit into contempt, and in time it would end in the churches breaking apart, and then in Western soldiers on the sea walls. It began with a ceremony, but all of that was still far off, and the empire had a war to fight much closer to home. The eastern frontier ran through mountains, the long limestone spine of the Taurus, and the anti-Taurus behind it, where the passes are few and the country is bare, and every route is known. For 3 centuries the war lived there. It had its own rhythm, and almost its own etiquette. Raiding columns coming through in the spring, the border forts signalling by beacon so that word of an incursion could reach the capital in a matter of hours across a chain of mountaintop fires. The population withdrawing into strongholds, the enemy burning what stood in the valleys and going home before the passes closed. Then, the empire returning the visit the following year. Nobody was trying to conquer anybody, most years. Cities were seldom taken. What was taken was livestock, harvests and people, and the ransoming of captives became a regular business between the two states, with exchanges arranged at agreed places on the river, prisoner for prisoner, sometimes with music. It sounds grinding, and it was, but it made the empire what it became. Generations of theme soldiers grew up in that country, knowing exactly how to fight it, how to shadow a raiding force without engaging, how to hold the high ground above a pass and take an army apart as it filed out below. The manuals they wrote survive, cold and practical, and they read like the work of men who had done it. The long frontier war trained the officers who, in the 10th century, would stop defending and start advancing. Not everyone on that frontier was loyal, and the empire's handling of one group is worth telling because it shows the age at its worst. The Paulicians were a Christian sect of the eastern borderlands, holding beliefs the church condemned as dualist, that the visible world was the work of an evil power, and the God of the Old Testament, not the God of Christ. The imperial answer was persecution, deportations, confiscations, executions of their leaders. So the Paulicians did what persecuted border peoples do. They went over to the caliphate, which was happy to shelter them, built themselves a fortified base, and spent decades raiding the empire that had driven them out, until imperial armies finally destroyed them in the 10th century and scattered the survivors into the Balkans, where their ideas took root and grew into other heresies still. The empire had manufactured its own enemy, and historians have counted it among its clearer failures. From the north, meanwhile, came something entirely new. In the year 860, without warning, a fleet of 200 ships came down out of the Black Sea and fell upon the suburbs of Constantinople. They were the Rus, Scandinavian traders and warriors who had worked their way down the great river roads of the east, dragging their boats between watersheds, and had built a power among the Slavic peoples that would in time become Russia. The emperor was away campaigning. The city, taken utterly by surprise, watched the coasts burn and prayed. The patriarch Photios preached a sermon that survives, full of astonishment at a people no one had ever heard of, arriving out of nowhere with the sea behind them. They came again in 907, and again in 941, and by then the empire was ready, and the fire met them at the mouth of the Bosphorus and burned their fleet down to the waterline. Men who survived described it afterward as lightning from heaven that even the water could not put out. And then, having beaten them, the empire did the more Byzantine thing. It signed treaties. The agreements set out where Rus merchants might live when they came to the city, how many could enter the gates at a time and by which gate, and what they might buy and sell, the honey and furs and wax of the north, exchanged for silk and wine and gold. Northern warriors began taking service with the emperors and would eventually form the Varangian Guard, the axe-bearing bodyguard that stood behind the throne for centuries. Enemies became trading partners, and trading partners became something closer, until in the 10th century their ruler would ask the empire for its faith. That was the pattern everywhere, and its greatest expression came in the year 863, when the Emperor Michael III and the Patriarch Photios chose two brothers from Thessalonica for a mission north. Their names were Constantine and Michael. History knows them by their monastic names, Cyril and Methodius. They were sent to Moravia in Central Europe, whose prince had asked for teachers who could preach in a language his people understood, and the brothers came from a city where Slavic was spoken in the streets. They knew the language. What they did was extraordinary. Rather than teaching the Slavs Greek, they built the Slavs a written language. Cyril devised an alphabet, the Glagolitic, a strange and beautiful script of circles and loops, unlike anything else, designed for sounds Greek letters could not carry. Then they translated the scriptures and the liturgy into it, so that Slavic Christians could hear the gospel and pray the services in their own tongue. Later, disciples working in Bulgaria simplified the system into the script that carries Cyril's name to this day, the Cyrillic that hundreds of millions still write. It was fiercely opposed. The German bishops in whose sphere Moravia lay held that God could properly be worshipped in only three languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and they harried the mission for years. The brothers travelled to Rome to argue their case and, remarkably, won it. Methodius was consecrated a bishop, though his opponents later imprisoned him for years anyway. Moravia itself was lost in the end to the Latin Church. But the seed had gone into the ground elsewhere. The disciples driven out of Moravia went south to Bulgaria, and from Bulgaria, the Slavonic liturgy and letters spread to the Serbs, and eventually north to the Rus, so that the whole Orthodox Slavic world, from the Adriatic to the forests above Kiev, prays in a written language 2 Greek brothers invented for it. Of everything Byzantium gave away, this was the gift that outlived the giver by the greatest margin. And now the empire that had spent 200 years surviving was about to spend 200 years winning. In the year 867, the throne passed, by murder, to a man who had begun life about as far from it as it was possible to begin. His name was Basil, and he had been a peasant boy from the Macedonian countryside who walked to the capital with nothing. He was famous for 2 things, his strength and his way with horses, and both of them were noticed. He came into the household of the Emperor Michael III as a groom, then as a wrestler, then as a favourite, then as a co-emperor. Then, one night in the year 867, Basil had Michael killed in his bedchamber and took the throne alone. It is not an edifying beginning, and the dynasty he founded never entirely lived it down. But that dynasty, the Macedonian house, named for the region he came from, ruled for nearly 2 centuries and presided over what everyone since has recognized as the golden age of the Byzantine world. What they achieved is worth naming plainly, because the reversal is remarkable. The empire that had spent 300 years being raided went on the attack. Through the 10th century, the great soldier emperors Nikephoros Phocas and John Tzimiskes led the armies of the Themes across the Taurus and took back what had been lost: Crete, Cyprus, Cilicia, and in 969, Antioch itself, the ancient patriarchal city of Syria, in imperial hands again after 330 years. Meanwhile, the missionaries went north, and the Bulgars and Serbs, and finally the Rus, came into the Christian world. And the emperors of this house, who thought of themselves quite consciously as heirs of Justinian, restored the prestige of the empire to something the world had not seen in centuries. The hardest of their wars was not in the east at all. It was in the Balkans, against the Bulgars. The Bulgars had come out of the steppe in the 7th century, crossed the Danube, settled among the Slavs, and made a state, and then, in the 9th, they had taken the empire's religion, the empire's letters, and much of the empire's ceremonial. That made them more dangerous, not less. A Christian Bulgaria could imagine itself an equal, and its rulers began to. The first who did it seriously was Simeon, who ruled at the start of the 10th century, and who had been educated in Constantinople as a boy, a hostage scholar who learned the empire's language, read its books, and understood exactly how its court thought. The Greeks called him half-Greek and meant it as an insult. He came home and turned all of it against them. He beat the imperial armies in the field, took the Balkan cities, and repeatedly brought his army up to the land walls themselves, at moments when the empire was fighting in the east and could not fight in 2 places at once. He wanted the title. He wanted to be emperor of the Romans and Bulgars together, in the city, crowned. He never got in, and he died in 927, and the great danger died with him. It rose again 2 generations later, in the west of the Balkans, under a ruler named Samuel, who built a new Bulgarian state among the mountains of Macedonia and Albania, hard country, full of defiles and lakes, where an army could disappear. And against him came the man who would settle the matter. Basil II took the throne in 976, as a young man nobody expected much from, and spent his first years fighting off 2 enormous rebellions by his own generals, which taught him, permanently, to distrust the great land-owning families, and to trust nothing but the army he built himself. He never married. He lived like a soldier, ate like one, and by all accounts had no interests outside the running of the state. He reigned for almost 50 years, the longest of any Byzantine emperor, and for 30 of those years he made war on Samuel in a campaign of pure attrition, not seeking one decisive battle, but going back every single season, taking one fortress, then the next, building his own fortresses behind him, and never giving back a mile of what he took. It ended in the year 1014 at a mountain pass called Clydion, where Basil's forces trapped the Bulgarian army and destroyed it. What he did afterward is the thing his name is welded to. The sources say he took some 15,000 prisoners and had them blinded, every 100th man left with one eye, so that he could lead the rest, and sent that long line of men shuffling home through the mountains to their king. Samuel, so the account goes, watched them come into his fortress, and died of a stroke within days. The empire remembered him ever after as Basil the Bulgar Slayer. Historians have argued about that story for a very long time. The number is suspiciously round. The account comes from a chronicler writing generations later, and mass blinding on that scale would have been a logistical undertaking in itself. Some think the figure inflated, others that the story grew in the telling of a real and terrible act. Nobody has been able to settle it, and the name has stuck regardless. The war ended in 1018 with the submission of the Bulgars, and Basil did something the empire rarely managed. He absorbed the whole of Bulgaria into the imperial administration, kept its church, taxed its people lightly at first, and made the Danube the frontier again for the first time in 400 years. When he died in 1025, the empire stretched from the Danube to Syria, from southern Italy to the Caucasus. Its currency was the gold standard of 3 continents. Its treasury was so full that Basil had to excavate new vaults beneath the palace to hold it. There was no state in the Christian world remotely comparable, and nothing in the Islamic world at that moment able to challenge it. This was the summit. And the city at that summit is worth standing in for a moment, because it is the best documented city in the medieval world, and the strangest. Perhaps 300,000 or 400,000 people lived there, the ancient numbers always shaky, but the scale is right. There was Hagia Sophia, and the Church of the Holy Apostles where the emperors were buried among porphyry tombs. The great palace, sprawling down toward the sea in a warren of halls and chapels and gardens. The hippodrome still running. Markets along the Golden Horn where you could buy anything made anywhere. And there was the ceremonial, which is the thing that most astonishes. We know it in extraordinary detail because one emperor, Constantine the Great, a scholar who had been shouldered aside from actual power for most of his life and filled the years with books, compiled a manual called the Book of Ceremonies, setting out exactly what the court did, on which day, wearing what, saying which words. Nothing at that court was casual. There were prescribed acclamations for each feast, prescribed robes for each season, a prescribed order in which officials entered a room. Foreign envoys were received in a hall where, by the account of one bemused Italian bishop, mechanical gilded lions crouched at the foot of the throne and roared. Bronze birds sang from a metal tree, and the throne itself rose slowly toward the ceiling while the visitor was prostrate, so that when he looked up, the emperor was above him in different robes. It was theatre and it was policy. A state that could not always afford armies could still afford awe. That scholar-emperor left something more valuable than the ceremonial manual, and it is the reason we can see the 10th century world as clearly as we do. Constantine the Great wrote, or had compiled, a book for his son, a private handbook on how to run an empire. It is known by its Latin title, De Administrando Imperio, and it is unlike anything else that survives from the Middle Ages. It is not propaganda. It was never meant for outside eyes. It is a candid briefing on the peoples surrounding the empire, who they are, where they came from, which of them hate each other, which can be bought, which must never be given imperial daughters in marriage, and what to say when they ask. The advice is dry and sometimes very funny. On the peoples of the steppe, keep them friendly because they can be set upon anyone else. On foreign princes who request imperial regalia or a bride from the palace, refuse, and if pressed, explain that these things were brought down from heaven by an angel and cannot be given away, the same convenient angel who delivered the secret of the fire. Constantine advises his son, in effect, that the empire's mystique is a resource, and that resources must be managed. Because he was a scholar, and because he set half the learned men in the city to compiling and copying, that whole world was written down, its provinces, its neighbours, its ceremonies, its history. Much of what anyone knows about the early Slavs, the Magyars, the Pechenegs, and the Rus comes to us through a Byzantine emperor's notes to his boy. And the greatest of the empire's diplomatic achievements came a generation after him. In the year 988, the prince of the Rus was a man named Vladimir, ruling from Kiev, and he had decided that his people needed a religion better suited to a state than the old gods of the forest. What follows is one of the best stories in the medieval world, and the earliest full version comes from a chronicle written a century later. So treat it as a tale with truth inside it, rather than a transcript. Vladimir, the account says, examined the faiths on offer. He heard the Muslim Bulgars of the Volga and was drawn to parts of it, but was told there could be no wine, and replied that drinking was the joy of the Rus, and they could not live without it. He heard the Jewish Khazars and asked where their homeland was. They said God had scattered them, and he answered that he had no wish to learn that lesson. He heard the Latin Germans and was unmoved. Then he sent envoys abroad to see for themselves. They went to the mosques and the Western churches and reported nothing memorable. And then they came to Constantinople, and the emperor had them brought to Hagia Sophia for the liturgy, the candles, the vestments, the chanting rising into that impossible dome, the incense hanging in the shafts of light from the ring of windows. When they came home, they told Vladimir they had not known whether they were on earth or in heaven, that God dwells there among men, and that they could not forget it. Whatever the envoys actually said, the politics were real enough. Vladimir received baptism, and with it something no barbarian ruler had ever been given, an emperor's sister. Anna, born in the purple chamber of the palace, sister to Basil II himself, was sent north to marry him, a concession that broke every rule in Constantine's handbook, and was extracted at a moment when Basil desperately needed Vladimir's Varangian warriors to put down a rebellion. The old gods were thrown into the Dnieper, and the people of Kiev were baptized in the river in their thousands. The consequences ran for 1,000 years. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are Orthodox because of that decision. They write in Cyrillic because of Cyril's disciples. Their churches are domed, and their icons gold-grounded, because Byzantine craftsmen came north to build and paint them. And when the empire itself was gone, the Russians would remember it as the mother of their civilization, and eventually claim its inheritance outright. But that comes much later. None of this diplomacy would have counted for anything without the machine underneath it. And the machine is what most impresses historians who study the period. At its base were the themes still, and their soldier farmers, each district under a general, a strategos, who held military and civil authority together. Above them, in the capital, sat a professional civil service of a sophistication nothing in Western Europe would approach for 500 years. Departments for the treasury, for the army's pay and supply, for the post and the roads and foreign intelligence, for the imperial wardrobe, each under a minister the age called a logothete. There were archives, there were files, there were career paths, and a system of ranked dignities that could be bought like an annuity, paying its holder an annual salary and a place in the processions. It was the most advanced government of the medieval world, and it had a specific genius. It was designed to run without genius. Emperors could be children, or scholars locked out of power, or brutes, and the tax still came in. The frontier posts were still supplied, the envoys still went out. That is why the empire could survive so many bad reigns. Its foundation was money, and the money was extraordinarily good. The gold coin of the empire, the numisma, which the West called the bezant, held its weight and purity essentially unchanged for 700 years, from Constantine to the 11th century. Nothing else in medieval history comes close. Merchants in Alexandria and Venice and the Baltic took it without weighing it, which is the truest measure of a currency there is. One Egyptian writer said it was accepted in every kingdom from one end of the earth to the other, because no other realm had anything comparable. And the wealth behind the coin came from the position we started with, the city sitting on the knot of the world's roads. Duties on everything crossing the straits, the silk monopoly, grain and wine and oil from the provinces, taxed by a land assessment more thorough than anything in the West. Craftsmen organized into guilds and regulated in fine detail by an imperial handbook that specified who could sell what and where and at what markup. All of it, the armies, the fleets, the mosaics, the gold-plated ceremonial, and the bribes to distant chieftains, rested on that stream of revenue. Which is worth remembering, because within 50 years of Basil's death, the coin began to be debased, the theme armies were let go, and the men who ran the state stopped being the men who fought for it. Before we follow that unravelling, there is one more inheritance from the Golden Age to set down, and it may be the one that mattered most to the rest of the world. The 10th century was, in the empire's own terms, a renaissance. The Macedonian Renaissance, historians call it, and the name is not an exaggeration. Scholars in the city went back to the classical past deliberately, hunting old manuscripts, copying them into the new, clear, minuscule handwriting that made books cheaper and faster to produce, and compiling the results into vast encyclopedias and anthologies. The presiding genius was Photios, patriarch and scholar, whose bibliotheca is one of the odder treasures of literature, a running account of several hundred books he had read, with summaries and judgments, and roughly half of those books no longer exist anywhere else. Ancient histories, lost romances, forgotten theology, known now only because a 9th century churchman wrote down what was in them and what he thought of them. Alongside the books came the art. This was the age of the mosaics and the carved ivories, of gospel books painted in gold and lapis, of small, perfect cross-in-square churches built across the empire and its neighbours. Byzantine artists had settled into a visual language of great authority. Flat gold grounds, elongated figures, faces of enormous stillness, and it spread wherever the missionaries went. The point is that the empire was, all through these centuries, the librarian of antiquity. In the West, Homer and Plato and Thucydides had largely vanished from view. Scholars there worked with what Latin they had inherited. In Constantinople, the Greek classics were read, taught, argued over, and, crucially, recopied, each generation renewing the physical books before they crumbled. Nearly every ancient Greek text now in existence comes down through a Byzantine copy. When Italy rediscovered that world 4 centuries later, it was not rediscovering something buried. It was being handed something that had been kept. Now to the unravelling, which came faster than anyone would have believed. Basil II died in 1025, leaving an empire without a serious rival and a treasury nobody could spend. Within 50 years, most of it was gone. The men who came after him were, for the most part, creatures of the palace rather than the camp, bureaucrats, courtiers, and the husbands of empresses, since the dynasty ran out of men and the throne passed for a while through the hands of Basil's aging nieces. The civil aristocracy of the capital had spent decades resenting the soldier emperors, and now it governed. And it did the thing that peaceful governments with strong armies and no visible enemies have always been tempted to do. It economized on defense. The theme armies were allowed to wither. Military service was commuted for cash payments, which looked like efficiency and meant that the soldier farmers stopped being soldiers. The frontier forces in Armenia were disbanded outright. Mercenaries were hired in their place, which was cheaper on paper and disastrous in fact, since mercenaries go home. The great landowners swallowed the small holdings that Basil had spent his reign protecting, so the free peasantry that had filled the ranks and the tax rolls thinned away. And the gold coin, unaltered for 7 centuries, began quietly to be debased. Meanwhile, 3 new enemies arrived at once. In Italy, Norman adventurers, younger sons out of France with nothing but ability, took the Byzantine provinces of the south piece by piece. Across the Danube came the Pechenegs and later the Cumans, steppe horsemen raiding into the Balkans. And in the east there was something entirely new, the Seljuk Turks, a people out of Central Asia who had swept into the lands of the Caliphate, taken Baghdad, and now stood against the empire's eastern border with the momentum of conquerors. By the 1060s the situation was plain enough that the empire tried to correct course, and raised to the throne a soldier, Romanos IV Diogenes, with a mandate to rebuild the army and drive the Turks back. He marched east in the summer of 1071 with a large force of dubious quality, theme troops long neglected, mercenaries of several nations, and beneath it all a court aristocracy that regarded him as a usurper and did not want him to win. In August the army came to Manzikert, a fortress in the highlands near Lake Van, and met the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle was lost less by the enemy's skill than by the empire's own divisions. The Turks fought in their steppe fashion, giving ground and shooting, drawing the imperial line forward across open country all day. When Romanos finally turned his army to withdraw at dusk, the rear division, commanded by a member of the rival family that wanted him gone, read the maneuver as a rout, or chose to, and marched off the field. The line came apart, the emperor's guard was surrounded, and Romanos himself was taken alive. What followed was almost gracious. Alp Arslan treated his captive with the courtesy the age expected of a victor, entertained him, and released him within days on terms that were, by the standards of the disaster, mild. Tribute, some frontier towns, an alliance. He had no intention of taking Anatolia. He wanted Egypt. The catastrophe came afterward, and it came from inside. Romanos returned to an empire that had already deposed him. He was defeated in the civil war that followed, betrayed under oath, and blinded, brutally, by an inexperienced hand, and died of the wounds. And for 10 years the empire tore itself apart, general against general, faction against faction, each side hiring Turkish warbands to fight the other and paying them in land. That is how Anatolia was lost. Not on the battlefield, but in the decade after, while the Byzantines were busy with each other and let the Turks in as allies. By 1081, the Turkish horsemen were watering their horses in sight of Constantinople, and the plateau that had bred the empire's soldiers and paid its taxes for 4 centuries, the heartland, the country of the themes, was gone. Historians still debate how decisive that single August afternoon really was. Some call Manzikert the hinge of Byzantine history. Others point out that the empire recovered a great deal afterward, and that the true wound was the civil war. But the shape is not in dispute. The empire that emerged from those years was a coastal power with an interior held by someone else, and it would spend its remaining 4 centuries trying to get that interior back. And then, in 1081, at the bottom of everything, a young general took the throne in a coup and set about saving what was left. His name was Alexios Komnenos. He was 33 years old, and the empire he inherited had no army, no money, Normans landing in the west, and Turks in sight of the walls. He held it for 37 years, and by the end he had built something new out of the wreckage. Alexios came from the military aristocracy, and he ruled through it, marrying his relations into every great family and giving them the commands, so that the state became, in effect, an extended clan business with the emperor at its head. It was a break with the old impersonal bureaucracy, and it worked because the old bureaucracy had failed. He rebuilt the army on a different principle. There was no money to pay soldiers and no free peasantry left to conscript. So instead, he gave away revenue, grants called pronoia, the right to collect the taxes of a district in return for service and for bringing armed men. It was not quite Western feudalism, but it rhymed with it, and it put cavalry back in the field. He debased the coinage further and then stabilized it into a new system, taxed the church's treasures when he had to, and fought Modena against the Normans in the west, the Pechenegs in the north, the Turks in the east. Modena usually with inferior forces, usually by maneuver, ambush and negotiation rather than pitched battle. The Normans nearly finished him at the start. Robert Guiscard, the most formidable adventurer of the age, crossed the Adriatic in 1081 with the intention of taking the empire itself, beat Alexios badly, and was stopped only by Venetian ships, Guiscard's own death, and a great deal of gold spent in Italy to make trouble behind him. The Norman kings of Sicily would come back at the empire again and again through the next century. We know that reign more intimately than almost any other in medieval history because his daughter wrote it down. Anna Comnene, born in the purple, educated in philosophy and medicine, shut out of the succession and eventually confined to a monastery, spent her later years composing the Alexiad, a long, learned, fiercely partisan account of her father's reign in deliberately archaic Greek. It is the first substantial history we have by a woman in the European tradition, and it is invaluable and completely unreliable in the same paragraph. Her father is a hero out of Homer. The Westerners are barbarians, treated with a fastidious contempt that is, in its way, a perfect record of how the Byzantine elite saw them. Which brings us to the great mistake, and it began as a reasonable request. Alexios needed men. He wrote to the Pope and to the princes of the West, asking for mercenaries, professional soldiers, hired under his command to help him retake Anatolia. It was standard practice. The empire had been hiring Westerners for decades. What arrived in 1096 was not mercenaries. It was the First Crusade. Tens of thousands of armed pilgrims and knights and princes moving under their own leadership toward Jerusalem, with their own priests and their own idea of what God wanted, marching across imperial territory in numbers that could not be fed and would not take orders. Alexios did what he could, extracted oaths from the leaders that conquered cities would be returned to the empire, shepherded them across the Bosphorus as fast as possible, and got real value out of it, recovering the western coasts of Anatolia while the Turks were occupied. But the oaths did not hold. When the Crusaders took Antioch after a terrible siege, they kept it, arguing that the emperor had failed to relieve them and had forfeited his claim. Alexios argued that they had sworn. Both sides were partly right, and both concluded the other had betrayed them first. The Crusader states that grew up along the Syrian coast became permanent neighbours, sometimes clients, sometimes rivals, always a reminder that the West could put armies into the East whenever it liked. The suspicion was already deepened by what had happened in the Great Church a generation before. The Eastern and Western churches had been drifting for centuries, over the Pope's claim to authority over all bishops, over a clause the West had added to the creed, over unleavened bread and married priests and 100 smaller frictions. In 1054, a papal delegation came to Constantinople to settle matters with the Patriarch Michael Kerularios, and the two sides took an instant and mutual dislike to one another. The chief legate finally walked into Hagia Sophia during the liturgy and laid a bull of excommunication on the altar. The patriarch excommunicated the legates in return. Nobody at the time thought it was final. There had been ruptures before, and they had been patched. But this one was never patched, and the churches of East and West have been separate ever since. A division that would matter enormously in the centuries to come, when the empire needed Western help, and could only get it at the price of submission. Meanwhile, the Komnenoi made another bargain, and this one hollowed the empire out from the inside. They needed fleets, and building fleets is expensive. Venice had fleets. So the price of Venetian naval help against the Normans was a grant of trading privileges, exemption from the customs duties that every Byzantine merchant paid, and a quarter of their own along the Golden Horn. Pisa and Genoa followed, with quarters of their own quarrels, and their own street violence. It looked like a good trade at the time. It was a slow catastrophe. Italian merchants paying nothing could undersell imperial merchants paying the full duty in their own city. The carrying trade of the eastern Mediterranean passed into Italian hands, and with it the customs revenue that had funded the state since Constantine. Later emperors tried to claw the privileges back and found they could not. The Venetians simply refused, and had the ships to make refusal stick. Historians count this among the surest causes of the empire's long decline. It gave away its commerce to buy protection, and ended with neither. The men of the Komnenian house were nevertheless impressive. John II, Alexios' son, was probably the finest of them, a plain, decent, relentless soldier who campaigned nearly every year for a quarter century, recovering territory in Anatolia and the Balkans, and died in a hunting accident when a poisoned arrow scratched his hand. Then Manuel I, brilliant and restless and fatally ambitious, who fascinated the Westerners and half became one. He held tournaments, jousted himself, married a Latin princess, and dreamed of reuniting the two empires and the two churches under his own hand. And through all of it, Constantinople was still, in the 12th century, the wonder of the Christian world. Its harbours crowded, its markets loud in a dozen languages, its relics drawing pilgrims from everywhere, its wealth beyond the imagination of the Western knights who passed through on their way to Jerusalem and stared. Some of them went home and did not forget what they had seen. One who wrote it down was a Jewish traveller from Navarre, Benjamin of Tudela, who came through in the 12th century and tried to convey the scale of the place to readers at home. He described the tribute flowing in from every province, the silks and gold in the streets, the people going about dressed like princes. He wrote that the wealth of that one city was not to be found in any other on earth. He noted the Italian quarters along the Golden Horn, the Jewish community across the water at Galata, the Rus and the Arabs in the markets. Perhaps 400,000 people, by the uncertain reckoning of the age. He also noticed something else, that the Greeks hired foreigners to do their fighting, and that the citizens themselves were unwarlike. The observation would prove exact. The relationship with the Latin merchants had been souring for years. Byzantines resented the tax-free foreigners growing rich in their city. The Latins resented Greek contempt and Greek attempts to play them against each other. In 1182, the resentment boiled over, and the population of Constantinople massacred the Italian residents of the city. Thousands of them, men, women, and children. The survivors sold into slavery. Word of it reached Italy and settled there, waiting. Then, at the end of the century, Pope Innocent III called a new crusade, and it was to sail for Egypt. What went wrong is a chain of decisions, each one comprehensible, ending somewhere no one had intended. The Crusaders contracted with Venice for a fleet sized for an army far larger than the one that actually turned up, and so arrived unable to pay. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, then in his 90s and blind, and one of the most formidable men of his century, offered them terms. Work off the debt first. So the Crusades' opening act was the siege of Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic that Venice wanted back from the King of Hungary. The Pope excommunicated the whole expedition for it. They took Zara anyway and wintered there. And at Zara, a proposal arrived. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, whose father had been deposed and blinded by his uncle, offered a bargain. "Put me on the throne, and I will pay your debts, fund the expedition to Egypt, bring the Greek church under Rome, and join you with an army." It sounded like the answer to everything. The fleet turned east. The walls held the first time. In the summer of 1203, the Crusaders forced the harbour chain and attacked from the Golden Horn side, where the defences were weakest, and the reigning emperor fled in the night. So the young man got his throne, and the Crusaders camped outside, waiting to be paid. He could not pay. The sums he had promised did not exist. He stripped the churches of their plate trying, which turned his own people against him, and within months he had been overthrown and strangled by a Byzantine faction that wanted the Latins gone. The Crusaders now had no patron, no money, no way home that did not involve returning as failures, and in front of them, the richest city on earth, ruled by people they had come to despise, whose church had been declared schismatic, and whose new emperor was a usurper. The clergy with the army told them it would be no sin. On the 12th of April, 1204, they attacked again from the water, lashed ships together to bring assault bridges against the sea walls, and got men onto the towers. A gate was forced from inside, and the walls of Theodosius, which had turned back Avars and Persians and Arabs and Bulgars and Rus for 800 years, were breached at last by Christians from the west. This is the third anchor of our story, and the one that never healed. The sack lasted 3 days. The Crusaders plundered the greatest city in the Christian world with a thoroughness that shocked even their own chroniclers. Churches stripped of their silver, altars broken up for the stones, the tombs of the emperors opened, and the bodies pulled out for their jewellery, libraries scattered, bronze statues that had stood since antiquity melted for coin. In Hagia Sophia, a woman was set on the patriarch's throne to sing, while men loaded the sacred vessels onto pack mules brought inside the church. The relics, the greatest collection in Christendom, went west by the shipload and are scattered through European cathedrals to this day. The 4 great bronze horses from the Hippodrome went to Venice, where they still stand above the doorway of St. Mark's. Both sides recorded it with horror. A Byzantine senator who lived through it wrote that even the Saracens had been merciful by comparison. The Pope who had called the crusade condemned it in furious terms when he learned what his army had done. Nothing about the Greek world's relations with the West was ever the same. The empire lost, in those 3 days, not only its accumulated treasure, but the material basis of recovery: the workshops, the ships, the archives, the reserves. And it gained a memory. When, 2.5 centuries later, Western help was offered again on condition of church union, there were Byzantines who said openly that they would rather see the Sultan's turban in their city than the cardinal's hat. And 1204 is what they meant. What the conquerors set up in the ruins never worked. The Latin Empire, with a Flemish count as emperor, and the territory carved into fiefs among the barons and the Venetians, was weak from its first day. It had the city and not the country. It could not command the revenues that had made the old empire work, and the Greek population regarded it as an occupation. Within a year its army was destroyed at Adrianople by the Bulgarian Tsar Kaloyan, and its first emperor died in a Bulgarian prison. It survived for 57 years by hanging on, selling relics and stripping lead from roofs to pay its debts, while the world moved around it. Because the empire had not actually died. It had scattered into exiles that each claimed to be the true continuation. One took root in Epirus in the western mountains, another far off on the Black Sea coast at Trebizond, which would outlast everything else. And the one that mattered established itself at Nicaea, across the water in Bithynia, the town where Constantine's bishops had met 900 years before. Nicaea did something remarkable. It behaved like a state. Theodore Lascaris, who founded it, held off Latins and Turks long enough to be crowned by a patriarch in exile, so that the essential things, emperor, patriarch, liturgy, law, went on existing somewhere. And his son-in-law, John III Vatatzes, who ruled through the middle of the century, turned it into the best-governed realm in the eastern Mediterranean. He was a frugal, patient, exceptionally able man. He built up the army and the administration, encouraged farming so the state could feed itself without buying from Italians, and famously paid for a crown for his wife out of the profits of his own poultry, a story the Greeks told for centuries as a lesson about what an emperor should be. He took back most of the European lands, boxed the Latins into their city, and left his heirs a state simply waiting for the right moment. He was made a saint after his death, and the moment he had prepared came in the summer of 1261, almost by accident. By then the man in charge at Nicaea was Michael Palaiologos, who had taken the regency for a child emperor and then quietly pushed the child aside, an act he would eventually be excommunicated for, and which shadowed his whole reign. In July of 1261, he sent a general named Alexios Strategopoulos west with a modest force on a reconnaissance. Look at the defences, take stock, do not attempt anything. Strategopoulos got close and learned from local farmers that the Venetian fleet and most of the garrison had sailed off on a raid, leaving the city nearly empty. There was a passage under the wall the locals knew about. That night, the 25th of July, a handful of his men went through, came up inside, overpowered the guards on a gate, and opened it. By morning, the city was in Greek hands. The Latin emperor fled to a Venetian ship in his nightclothes, leaving his crown and sword behind, and the Latin Empire of Constantinople simply ceased to exist. Michael, camped in Anatolia, was woken with the news and did not believe it until the regalia were laid in front of him. He entered the city 3 weeks later, walking behind an icon of the Virgin carried at the head of the procession, and was crowned in Hagia Sophia. The Roman Empire was back in its capital after 57 years, and what he found there was heartbreaking. Half the districts were burned out and abandoned, palaces stood roofless, churches had been stripped and never repaired, the population had collapsed and never returned. The city had been living for 2 generations off its own fabric. Michael VIII spent the rest of his reign trying to hold what he had taken, and the greatest danger came from the west. Charles of Anjou, brother of the King of France, had made himself King of Sicily and was assembling a coalition to retake Constantinople and finish what 1204 had begun. Against a threat of that size, Michael had no army adequate to the task, so he used the 2 weapons the empire had left: gold and diplomacy. He offered Rome the thing Rome had always wanted. At the Council of Lyon in 1274, his envoys accepted the union of the churches, papal primacy, the disputed clause in the creed, the lot. The Pope accepted and duly forbade Charles to attack a Catholic prince. It worked, and it cost him his own people. The clergy and the population of the empire rejected the union with something close to fury. Monks refused communion with unionist bishops. His own sister said she would rather see the empire ruined than sold to Rome. Michael imprisoned, blinded, and exiled the opposition, which made martyrs and hardened everything. When he died in 1282, he was denied a Christian burial by his own church, and his son repudiated the union within months. He had also, quietly, been funding the enemies of Charles of Anjou in Sicily, and in 1282 the island rose in revolt, the Sicilian Vespers, and Charles's fleet burned in the harbour. The invasion never came. Michael said afterward, with justice, that God had used him as the instrument of the empire's deliverance. His subjects did not agree. That episode is the whole last age in miniature. The empire could still be clever, and cleverness could still buy time, but every purchase cost something that could not be replaced. What Michael restored was, in truth, a small state with a great city. Anatolia was gone but for a coastal strip, and going faster. The Balkans were contested by Serbs and Bulgars. The seas belonged to Venice and Genoa. The dynasty he founded, the Palaiologoi, would rule for nearly 200 years, the longest of any Byzantine house, and would preside over an unbroken decline that they fought every step of the way. The killing blow was self-inflicted. In the 14th century, the empire tore itself apart in two long civil wars, fought between rival branches and factions for a throne that was worth less every year. The tragedy is who fought them. John Cantacuzenios, the ablest man of his generation and a genuine statesman, against the regency of a child emperor, both sides fully aware that the fighting was fatal, neither able to stop. To win, they invited outsiders in. Serbs were hired, and Turks. Cantacuzenios brought Ottoman troops across into Europe as allies and married his daughter to their emir. And in 1354, those allies took a fortress on the European shore of the Dardanelles after an earthquake threw down its walls, and did not leave. That is how the Ottomans entered Europe, not by invasion, but by invitation, as the paid auxiliaries of a Byzantine faction. Meanwhile, Serbia under Stefan Dusan grew into the great Balkan power, and the Black Death came through in 1347, and the treasury reached the point where the crown jewels were in pawn to Venice, and the imperial banquet plate was made of pewter and clay. A visiting Arab traveller, Ibn Battuta, walked the streets around this time and described a city of 13 separate villages inside one wall, with fields and orchards where districts had been. By the end of the century, perhaps 100,000 people lived there, in a city built for 4 times that. Vines grew in the ruins. The sources of the age write about it with a melancholy that comes through the centuries, men who knew exactly what had been lost, walking past it every day. And yet, and this is the strange, luminous thing about the last age, the mind of the empire was never brighter. The Paleologan period produced its finest painting in centuries, the frescoes and mosaics of the Chora Church in the capital among them, full of movement and feeling. Its scholars went back to Plato with an intensity nobody had brought to him in 1,000 years. Its theologians fought out the great dispute over the vision of divine light in prayer, the hesychast controversy, and settled orthodox spirituality for good. A dying state doing its best work. There was one more attempt to buy survival, and it repeated the pattern exactly. With the Ottomans closing in, the Emperor John VIII sailed to Italy in person, with the Patriarch and a delegation of bishops, and spent months at the Council of Florence, arguing point by point until, in 1439, union with Rome was proclaimed a second time. He got the signatures. He got promises of a crusade. The crusade came in 1444 and was destroyed at Varna on the Black Sea. And at home, the union was rejected as furiously as the first had been. One of the bishops who had been at Florence refused to sign and became a hero for it. The population would not attend services where the Pope's name was read. The empire entered its final decade, divided against itself over the terms of a rescue that had not arrived, which left the city and the walls, and one young sultan across the water who had decided that the time had come. Where that sultan's house had come from is worth understanding, because nothing about it looked inevitable at the start. Around the year 1300, the old Seljuk order in Anatolia had broken into a scatter of small Turkish principalities, and the one in the far northwest, nearest the Byzantine frontier, and therefore the poorest and most exposed, belonged to a chieftain named Osman. It was one emirate among a dozen, and not the most promising. Its name has come down to us as Ottoman. Its advantage was precisely its position. On the frontier, there were always Byzantine towns to raid, always plunder to distribute, always land to give men who came to fight. So warriors from all over the Turkish world drifted west toward Osman's banner, because that was where the opportunities were. And the Ottomans were unusually good at absorbing rather than expelling. Greek soldiers took service with them. Greek landowners kept their estates by converting or paying. Christian villages found the tax burden lighter than the empire's. What grew was less a tribe than a magnet. Osman's son Orhan took Bursa in 1326 and made it a capital. Then the other cities of the northwest, Nicaea itself, the town where the empire had survived in exile, fell in 1331. Then, as we have seen, they crossed into Europe at the invitation of a Byzantine faction and stayed. Murad I turned that foothold into an empire. He took Adrianople, the great Thracian city a few days' march from Constantinople, and moved his capital there, into Europe, behind the Byzantines rather than in front of them, so that from that moment the city was outflanked. He built the standing infantry corps of the Janissaries, and in 1389, at Kosovo Polje, the Field of Blackbirds, he broke the power of Serbia in a battle that both sides afterward mythologized and in which he himself was killed. The Balkan states became vassals. Their princes rode in Ottoman armies. Then Bayezid called the Thunderbolt for the speed of his marching. He swallowed the last Byzantine holdings in Anatolia, crushed a Western crusade at Nicopolis in 1396, and from 1394 he blockaded Constantinople itself for 8 years, cutting the roads, starving the city slowly, waiting for it to fall into his hand. It did not fall, and the reason came out of nowhere. Far to the east, Timur, Tamerlane, had built a conquering empire across Central Asia, and in 1402 he came west and met Bayezid at Ankara. The Ottoman army was destroyed. The Sultan was taken alive and died in captivity, and his sons spent the next decade fighting each other for the wreckage. Historians have long noted the irony. The Christian empire was saved, for 50 more years, by a Muslim conqueror from Samarkand, who had never heard a Byzantine argument in his life and cared nothing for the city. It was the last piece of luck the empire ever had. During the worst of the blockade, the Emperor Manuel II did something no ruler of Constantinople had ever done. He left. From 1399 to 1403, he travelled through Western Europe in person, seeking help. He went to Venice, to Milan, to Paris, and then across to London, where Henry IV received him at Christmas and held a joust in his honour. Everywhere he was met with astonishment and reverence. The Emperor of the Romans, the successor of Constantine and Justinian, in the flesh, in a plain dark robe with a long white beard, asking for soldiers. An English official who saw him wrote sorrowfully about it. This great Christian prince, driven from his throne to the far islands of the West, begging aid against the infidel. And what more could one say of a dignity that had come to this? He was given banquets, sympathy, and promises. He was given no army. Europe was busy. England and France were fighting each other. The papacy had 2 rival claimants. The Italian cities had their own wars. He went home after 4 years with almost nothing, arriving to find that Ankara had done for him what all the courts of Christendom would not. That journey is the clearest picture we have of what the empire had become. A name so venerable that kings rose when it entered a room, attached to a state that could no longer defend a single province. And yet, in those same decades, something in the Byzantine world was flowering. On Mount Athos, the monastic peninsula in the northern Aegean, monks practiced a way of prayer that tradition called hesychia, stillness. It involved a short invocation of the name of Jesus, repeated continually, joined to the breath, until prayer became something the whole person did rather than something the mind said. And the hesychasts claimed that in this stillness a man could come to see, with his own eyes, the uncreated light of God, the same light the apostles saw on the mountain at the Transfiguration. A learned monk from Italy, Balaam of Calabria, thought this was nonsense and said so with some contempt. God is unknowable, the light was a symbol, and these men were mistaking their own sensations for divinity. The defense was undertaken by Gregory Palamas, an Athonite monk and later archbishop, and it produced some of the finest theology the Christian East ever wrote. Palamas distinguished between God's essence, which no creature can approach or know, and God's energies, which are God himself, truly reaching into the world and genuinely encounterable. Grace is not a created gift passed down from a distance. It is God, present. And so, Palamas argued, the vision the monks described was neither symbol nor delusion, but the real thing, given to a person made ready by prayer. The councils of the 14th century decided in his favour, and that decision is one of the load-bearing walls of Orthodox Christianity to this day. The reason the Eastern churches speak of salvation as becoming partakers of the divine nature, rather than as a legal acquittal. It also passed north into Russia, where it shaped monasticism for centuries, and it is the root of that whole tradition of interior prayer that later readers would meet in the Russian spiritual writers. Hold that beside the political story, and the contrast is almost unbearable. The state was in pawn to Venice. The emperor was riding around Europe with a begging letter. The sultan's armies were camped in the suburbs, and in the monasteries of a dying empire, men were settling questions about the nature of God that 100 million people still live by. The empire's body was failing. Its mind and its soul were working right up to the last morning. By the 1440s, the end was clearly coming. The crusade that Florence had bought was destroyed at Varna. The Peloponnese, where a Byzantine despotate had survived at Mistra, was raided at will. The city itself was down to a rump of neighbourhoods and gardens, its emperor a tributary who paid for permission to exist. And in February of 1451, the Ottoman throne passed to a 19-year-old who had already been sultan once as a boy, had been humiliatingly set aside, and had come back with a very clear idea of what he intended to be remembered for. His name was Mehmed, and everything about the city was already settled in his mind before he had a beard. There was one other Byzantine land still standing, and it deserves a mention before the end, because of what grew there. The Morea, the southern peninsula of Greece, the old Peloponnese, had been given out as an appanage to the sons and brothers of emperors, and its capital was Mistra, a fortress town climbing a steep spur below Sparta. In the last century of the empire, Mistra became something unexpected, a place of churches with the finest frescoes of the age, of palaces on the hillside, and of a school of philosophers gathered around a strange and brilliant old man named Plethon, who taught Plato so fervently that he came at last to believe the Greeks should abandon Christianity altogether and return to the gods of Homer. He went to the Council of Florence in the emperor's train and lectured the Italians on Plato, and they never recovered from it. That is where the last emperor came from. Constantine the 11th Palaeologos had governed the Morea as despot, defended it capably, and was crowned at Mistra in 1449 because his capital was too divided over the church union to crown him quietly. He was 50 when the end came, a soldier rather than a scholar, without an heir, without money, and, by every account, hostile or friendly, without any thought of running. Across the water, Mehmed II had spent 2 years preparing with a thoroughness that frightened his own ministers, some of whom counselled patience and were removed. First, he closed the Bosphorus. In the summer of 1452, on the European shore just north of the city, he built a fortress, Rumeli Hisari, the throat cutter, as it was called, in under 5 months, with cannon covering the strait, so that no ship could reach Constantinople from the Black Sea without his permission. He proved the point by sinking a Venetian vessel that tried to run past and impaling its captain. Then he acquired the artillery. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had come to the emperor first, offering to cast the greatest cannon ever made. The emperor could not pay him, so Urban crossed to the Sultan, who asked whether he could build a gun capable of breaking the walls of Constantinople, paid him 4 times what he asked, and let him work. What came out of the foundry at Adrianople was a bombard more than 8 meters long, throwing a stone ball of some 600 kilograms, which required 60 oxen and 200 men to drag it into position, and could be fired only a handful of times a day, because it had to cool or it would crack. Against that, the city had perhaps 7,000 defenders, some 4,000 or 5,000 Greeks, and around 2,000 foreigners, mostly Italians, to hold 20 kilometers of wall. The Sultan brought something in the region of 80,000 men and a fleet. The numbers in the sources are as unreliable as ever, but no reading of them makes the odds anything but hopeless. And still, the walls were the walls. Everyone on both sides knew their history. The siege opened on the 6th of April, 1453. The great gun began its work against the middle section of the land walls in the valley of the Lycus stream, where the ground is lowest, and the bombardment went on day after day, a noise, one witness said, that could be heard 100 stadia away, that shook the whole city, and that made the women in the churches fall down. But stone walls absorbed stone shot in a way that surprised the gunners. Sections came down. The defenders went out at night with earth, timber, barrels and rubble, and rebuilt them into ramparts that were, if anything, better at swallowing cannonballs than the masonry had been. Each morning the Turks found the breach filled. This went on for weeks. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, a professional soldier who had come with 700 men at his own expense, directed the repairs and the fighting on the walls, and he was very good at it. The sea held too, at first. A great iron chain on floats closed the mouth of the Golden Horn, and in a spectacular action in April, 4 Christian ships fought their way through the entire Ottoman fleet in sight of both armies and got inside the boom, while Mehmed rode his horse into the shallows in rage. So he did the thing that everyone remembers. If he could not force the chain, he would go around it. In a single night, his men laid a greased timber road over the ridge behind Galata and dragged some 70 ships overland, out of the Bosphorus and down into the Golden Horn, hauling them up one slope and down the other with oxen and manpower, with sails set and drums beating as if the fleet were sailing across a hill. The Byzantines woke to find enemy ships inside the harbour, in water they had held for 1,100 years. It was not decisive by itself, but it was ruinous. It opened the weak seaward walls to attack, and it forced the defenders, who had no men to spare, to thin their line along the landward side to cover the Horn. Through May the assaults came and were beaten back, and the mining under the walls was met by countermining, and the towers that were rolled up were burned. The defenders were exhausted. There had been no relief, and there would be none. A Venetian fleet was supposed to be coming. A ship slipped out to look for it, searched the Aegean, found nothing, and came back to report that no help was on the sea, knowing that returning meant dying in the city. Toward the end of the month, the omens began. There was a lunar eclipse. A procession carrying the icon of the Virgin through the streets faltered when the image slipped from its bearers, and a thunderstorm broke over the city so violently that the streets ran and the procession had to be abandoned. Then a night when a strange light was seen playing about the dome of Hagia Sophia and rising from it, which the Greeks took, in their despair, for the Holy Spirit departing the great church. Mehmed announced the final assault for the 29th of May and promised his army the customary 3 days of plunder. On the evening of the 28th, the city stopped defending itself for a few hours and went to church. The bells rang, and the people came out of the houses and the walls, Greeks and Italians together, Unionists and their opponents together, the whole bitter quarrel over Rome set down for one night, and they carried the icons through the streets and up to Hagia Sophia. It was the last Christian service ever held in that building, and everyone present understood that. The emperor came, and the Venetians and the Genoese who had been at each other's throats for weeks, and the priests who had refused to say the Pope's name in the liturgy. They confessed, they took communion, and the accounts say the great church was full of weeping. Then Constantine spoke to them. The words come to us through a Greek chronicler and are certainly polished, but the substance is not in doubt. That a man should be ready to die for his faith, for his country, for his family, and for his sovereign. That they were the descendants of Greeks and Romans and should be worthy of it. That the city had been their refuge for 1100 years, and this was the day. He asked forgiveness of anyone he had wronged. Then he went out to the walls. The attack came in the darkness after midnight, and Mehmed sent it in waves, deliberately, in ascending order of quality. First the irregulars, the volunteers and adventurers who had come for plunder, thousands of them, poorly armed, driven forward over the ditch and cut down in the breaches. They were expended to tire the defence, and they did. Then the Anatolian regiments, disciplined troops in proper armour, who came at the weakest sector in the Lycus Valley and briefly got onto the rampart before they were thrown back off it. And then, as the sky began to grey, the Janissaries, the Sultan's own household infantry, the finest soldiers in Europe, advancing in silence to the sound of drums, in ranks that did not break when men fell. Two things happened in the space of a few minutes, and the city was lost between them. Somewhere along the wall to the north, a small postern, called the Kirko Porta, had been opened for a sortie, and, in the confusion, was not properly secured. A party of Turks found it, got inside, and ran up onto the towers, and Ottoman banners appeared above the wall behind the fighting line. And in the main breach, Justiniani, the Genoese who had held the defence together for 7 weeks, was hit and badly wounded. He asked to be carried off the wall to his ship. Constantine begged him to stay, or at least to leave his men in place, but he was taken out through the inner gate, and his soldiers, seeing their commander borne away and the gate standing open, went with him. The line simply came apart. The Janissaries poured into the gap. A giant of a man named Hassan is said to have been the first onto the rampart and to have died there with 12 wounds. But by then it did not matter. There were too many of them and too few of the others. The last emperor was seen near the breach with a handful of men, his cousin among them, and the accounts agree that he threw off the imperial insignia so that he would not be taken alive and recognized, and rode into the fighting. After that, nothing is certain. No one who watched him fall wrote it down. The Sultan's men later found a body they thought might be his, identified by the purple boots with the double eagles, and by tradition it was buried with honour. But it was never certainly him, and it never has been. The last Roman emperor simply vanishes into the crowd at the gate. The city fell in a few hours after that. Some of the defenders fought on in the streets. Some ran for the harbour, where a handful of Italian ships got out through the boom on a favourable wind, carrying a few thousand refugees. And the population, the ones who had not been on the walls, the women and the old and the children, did what the city had always done in disaster. They went to Hagia Sophia. There was a prophecy, and everyone knew it, that if the enemy ever entered the city and came as far as the great column in the Forum, an angel would descend with a sword and drive them back into the desert. So they gathered in the church and waited for the angel, and the doors were barred, and they prayed, and outside they could hear the fighting come closer. The doors were broken in with axes. The people inside were bound and led out through the streets in strings, the sources say, priests still in their vestments, and the church was stripped of its silver and its icons. It is the moment on which the whole Greek memory of the fall finally rests. The great church of the Holy Wisdom, 916 years old that spring, full of people waiting for a rescue that did not come. Mehmed entered the city that afternoon, riding through streets he had never seen, and went straight to Hagia Sophia. He found a soldier hacking at the marble floor for the stone, and struck him and rebuked him, saying that the plunder was theirs, but the buildings were his. He dismounted at the door, took up a handful of earth, and poured it over his own turban, an act of humility before God, in the moment of the greatest victory an Ottoman sultan would ever win. Then he went in and had a prayer said from the pulpit, and the church became a mosque. He was 21 years old. He took the title Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome, and he meant it. He had the histories of Alexander and the Caesars read to him, and he considered himself the heir of the empire he had just extinguished, not merely its conqueror. And afterward, walking through the ruined palaces of the emperors, the vast, mouldering great palace by the sea, empty for generations, its mosaics falling out of the walls, he is said to have stopped and quoted 2 lines of Persian verse, a poet's meditation on vanished kings, that the spider spins its web in the palace of the Caesars, and the owl calls the watch in the towers of Afrasiab. The accounts say he wept. On the 29th of May, 1453, the Roman Empire, which had been proclaimed in the year 27 before Christ, and had never once, in all its transformations, formally ceased, came to an end. This is the last of our anchors, the walls of Theodosius, which had turned back every enemy for 1,040 years, broken at last, and the city they sheltered passing into other hands. Somewhere in the confusion of that morning, the story goes, a priest was in the middle of the liturgy in the great church when the soldiers burst in, and he took up the chalice and walked into the south wall, which opened and closed behind him. He is still in there. When the city is Christian again, the wall will open, and he will come out and finish the sentence he was saying. Mehmed stopped the plunder early. He had promised 3 days and cut it short after 1, because he wanted a capital and not a ruin. And what he did over the following years is one of the more surprising chapters in the history of that city. He set about refilling it. He brought in settlers from all over his empire, Muslim and Christian and Jewish together, by inducement where he could, and by compulsion where he had to, and gave them empty houses and tax relief for taking them. He rebuilt the markets and repaired the water supply. He invited Greeks who had fled to come back, and many did. Within a generation, the population had climbed past anything the last Byzantine centuries had seen. Within a century, it was the largest city in Europe again, as it had been under Justinian. And he did something the Latin conquerors of 1204 had never dreamed of. He restored the Greek church. The patriarchate had been vacant. Mehmed had a patriarch elected, choosing, pointedly, Gennadios Scholarios, the most prominent opponent of the union with Rome, invested him personally with the staff of office, and confirmed the church in its property and its courts. The Orthodox Christians of the empire became a recognized community under their own bishops, taxed and subordinate, but intact. The reasoning was practical. A self-governing church was easier to rule through than a resentful crowd, and a patriarch who hated Rome would never invite a Western fleet. But the consequence was enormous. Through 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, the church became the vessel in which Greek identity survived. The schools were church schools, the courts were church courts, the language of the liturgy kept the language alive. Byzantium ended as a state, and continued as a congregation. The last fragments took a few more years. Mistra, up on its hillside below Sparta, surrendered in 1460, and the philosopher's town became a village. Trebizond, the little empire on the Black Sea coast that had outlasted everything, gave in the following year, and with it the last Greek ruler anywhere calling himself Emperor of the Romans, passed into captivity. Meanwhile, the city itself was becoming something magnificent again, in a new key. Mehmed built a palace on the Acropolis point where Byzas had put his town, Topkapi, looking out over the meeting of the waters. Later sultans raised the great mosques, and in the 16th century, the architect Sinan, the finest builder of his age, filled the skyline with domes. The Suleymaniye on its hill above the Golden Horn, and dozens more, all of them in open, deliberate conversation with Hagia Sophia. Sinan had studied that dome all his life. Every mosque he built was, in part, an argument with a Greek geometer 900 years dead. Hagia Sophia itself was preserved with care. Minarets were added at the corners. The mosaics were not destroyed but covered over, plastered and painted, since the images could not remain in a mosque, which is why so many of them are still there. When restorers came in the 20th century and lifted the plaster, the faces underneath had been waiting in the dark, essentially untouched. The great Christ of the Desis, with its extraordinary tenderness. The emperors and empresses in their gold. The building has since been a mosque, then a museum, and in our own time a mosque again. The argument over what it is has never quite stopped, because it has never stopped meaning too much to too many people. For the Greek world, the fall was not an ending, but the beginning of a long night the Greeks called the Turkocratia. And they told themselves stories about it. The best known is the tale of the emperor. Constantine did not die, the story goes. At the moment the walls broke, an angel took him and turned him to marble and hid him in a cave beneath the Golden Gate. He is sleeping there still, the marble emperor, and when the time comes the angel will wake him, put the sword back in his hand, and he will walk up through the city and take it back. There were others, the priest in the wall waiting to finish the liturgy, the fish being fried on the day of the fall that leapt from the pan half-cooked, and swims still in a spring near the walls, brown on one side and silver on the other, until the city is Greek again. Folklore does with a catastrophe what history cannot. It refuses to let it be final. That refusal had political consequences for centuries. It fed the dream of recovering the city that shaped modern Greek politics, and ended badly in the War of 1922. But it also kept a memory alive through 400 years, which is not nothing. And there was another claimant to the inheritance, far to the north. In 1472, a niece of the last emperor, Zoe Paleologina, raised in Rome after her family fled, was married to the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III. She took the name Sophia. Moscow began using the double-headed eagle of the Byzantine emperors as its own emblem, and its court took on Byzantine ceremonial, and its rulers began styling themselves by a word derived from Caesar, Tsar. Half a century after the fall, a monk of Pskov named Philotheus wrote to the ruler of Moscow the sentence that became a doctrine. 2 Romes had fallen, the old one to heresy, the second, Constantinople, to the Turks. Moscow was the 3rd Rome, and a 4th there would not be. Whether that idea meant in the 16th century what later Russian nationalists made it mean, historians debate energetically. But the claim was made, and it stuck, and the political weight of it has not finished being felt even now. So the empire ended, and immediately began to be inherited by the Sultan who called himself Caesar, by the church that outlived the state, by a prince in a cold northern city who married a refugee and took her family's eagle for his own, and by Italy, which received the empire's most valuable cargo of all. The books had been moving west for 2 generations before the walls came down. Greek scholars, seeing what was coming and unable to make a living in a bankrupt state, had been drifting to Italy since the late 14th century, looking for patrons. And they carried manuscripts with them, because manuscripts were what they had. Manuel Chrysoloras arrived in Florence in 1397 to teach Greek, the first serious public teaching of the language in the West in 700 years. And the young Italians who sat in his classroom described the experience afterward like a conversion. They had known that Homer and Plato and Demosthenes existed. They had not been able to read a word of them. Then came the councils and the fall and the refugees, and the trickle became a stream. Cardinal Bessarion is the central figure, a Greek bishop who had gone to Florence, accepted the union, stayed in Italy, and rose high in the Roman Church. He spent his fortune and the rest of his life buying up Greek manuscripts wherever the collapse of the Byzantine world shook them loose, hunting down texts before they could be lost, and he gathered the largest library of Greek books in existence. He gave the whole collection to Venice, explicitly so that the Greek inheritance would have a home now that his own country no longer did. It became the founding core of the Marciana Library, and it is still there. And old Plethon from Mistra had lectured in Florence on the differences between Plato and Aristotle with such fire that Cosimo de' Medici resolved on the spot to found an academy for the study of Plato in his city. That is a straight line, an eccentric philosopher from a fortress in the Peloponnese, arguing for a philosopher dead 19 centuries, and the whole Platonic current of the Italian Renaissance flowing out of it. By 1500, Venice had a printing house, the Aldine Press, producing the Greek classics in editions cheap enough for a scholar to own, set in type designed to imitate Byzantine handwriting, and edited largely by Greek exiles. What had survived as a few fragile copies in a besieged city was suddenly reproducible, hundreds at a time, and unlosable. It is worth being precise about what happened here, because the shorthand version, the Renaissance was caused by refugees from 1453, is too simple, and historians have spent a long time complicating it. Italy was already recovering its classical past for reasons of its own, but the Greek half of that inheritance came from Byzantium and nowhere else, and it came because generation after generation of Byzantine scribes had recopied Plato and Herodotus and Sophocles as the parchment aged, out of nothing more than the conviction that these were their own books and should not be allowed to perish. The empire's last gift was the contents of its libraries, and it arrived exactly when there was somebody ready to read them. There is a final irony to record, and it concerns the name. Nobody in the empire ever called it Byzantine. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans, to the last day, and their state simply the Empire of the Romans. Their neighbours did too. The Arabs called them Rum, and the Turks named the whole Balkan province Rumelia, the land of the Romans, and the word is still on maps. The label we use was invented after the fact. In 1557, a German scholar in Augsburg named Hieronymus Wolff, editing a collection of Greek chroniclers, needed a term to separate this empire from the classical Rome he considered the real one. So he reached back to the little Megarian colony of Byzas and called it Byzantine. The name stuck because it was convenient for Westerners who did not want to grant that the Roman Empire had gone on living in Greek, under a Greek liturgy, until the middle of the 15th century. And then the Enlightenment took that convenient label and buried the thing beneath it. Edward Gibbon, magnificent and merciless, treated the whole Eastern millennium as an appendix to Rome's decline, a monotonous tale of weakness and misery, priests and eunuchs and palace intrigue, 1,000 years without a virtue worth recording. Voltaire called it a disgrace to the human mind. For 2 centuries, the adjective Byzantine meant devious, overcomplicated, decadent, and it still does in ordinary speech. The 20th century reversed the verdict almost completely. Scholars went back to the sources, the chronicles, the seals, the coins, the law codes, the manuals of statecraft, the excavated walls, and found something entirely unlike Gibbon's caricature. a state of remarkable administrative sophistication, a continuous literary and scientific tradition, an art of extraordinary power, a diplomatic system that kept a small country alive between empires for 800 years, and a society far more resilient and far less rigid than anyone had assumed. The consensus now is that Byzantium was one of the major civilizations of world history, and that the older dismissal says more about the people making it than about the empire. The Greeks, meanwhile, had never needed convincing. When the modern Greek state emerged in the 19th century after 4 centuries under the Ottomans, it reached past classical Athens for its self-understanding and took Byzantium, the church, the emperors, the lost city, as its own past. So the empire is argued over still, and always in the present tense, which is perhaps the surest sign that it was never as remote as the textbooks made it sound. What it left behind is easier to point to than to summarize, so let us simply walk through it, slowly, one thing at a time. There is the law. Justinian's codification was never abandoned in the East. It was translated, updated, and reissued. The Macedonian emperors produced the great compilation called the Basilica, and generations of jurists wrote handbooks from it, so that the reasoning of Roman lawyers stayed continuously in use in one corner of the world, while the West forgot it. And when the West remembered, and the schools at Bologna began teaching the digest, that recovered inheritance grew into the civil law tradition that now underlies the legal systems of most of Europe, most of Latin America, and much of Asia and Africa. If you have ever signed a contract in one of those countries, you have touched the edge of it. There is the architecture. A dome over a square, a cross drawn in the floor plan, light coming in at the base of the roof so the ceiling seems to float. That idea was worked out in the 6th century and never really left. It went to Kiev and Novgorod and Moscow, to the monasteries of Serbia and Bulgaria and the mountains of Georgia, to Ravenna and Venice, and it shapes the skyline of Istanbul today through the mosques that answer it. Wherever you find an onion dome or a gold-ground icon, or a church laid out as a cross under a dome, you are looking at a Byzantine idea travelling. There is the art. The mosaics and the frescoes, the ivories and the enamels, and above all the icons, an entire visual language for the sacred that the Orthodox world took and has never set down. And there is the Orthodox world itself, which is the largest legacy of all. The Greeks, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Romanians, the Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians, the Georgians and Armenians, and the ancient churches of the Middle East. Some 300 million people whose faith, calendar, music, script, and habits of prayer come down from that city. The empire's missionaries went out to convert their neighbours and ended up making a civilization that outlived them by 600 years and counting. You can still go and stand in the middle of it. The walls of Theodosius run for kilometres through modern Istanbul, in stretches restored and stretches half-fallen, with vegetable gardens planted in the old ditch, and washing hung between the towers, and traffic pouring through the gaps where gates once stood. The Basilica cistern is still down there in the dark, the columns still standing in their reflections. The aqueduct of Valens still strides across its road. The Chora church still holds its mosaics of astonishing delicacy. And Hagia Sophia still rises above everything, exactly where it has been since 537. Take a slow breath now, and let the details settle. There is nothing left to follow. The story has been told in full, layer by layer, without hurry. The oracle at Delphi and the land of the blind, and the emperor who chose a headland at the meeting of 2 seas. The walls going up under Theodosius, and the factions who rebuilt them in a few weeks with Attila on the road. The dome that Justinian raised out of the ashes of a riot, and the law he set in order, and the plague that emptied the fields behind him. Heraclius bringing the cross home and losing the south. The fire on the water. The long frontier war in the mountains, and the icons taken down and put back. 2 brothers inventing an alphabet for a people who had none. The Bulgar slayer, and the envoys in the great church who could not tell whether they stood on earth or in heaven. Manzikert, and the Komnenoi holding the line. The crusaders in the harbour. The exile at Nicaea, and the night a gate was opened and the city came home. And the last morning, when the walls came down at last. You can let the names drift now. Constantine and Justinian and Theodora, Belisarius on his campaigns and Procopius writing them down, Heraclius in the mountains, Leo on the ramparts, Irene and the two Theodoras, Basil in the passes of Macedonia, Anna Komnene at her desk with her father's wars in front of her, Alexios and Michael, and the long line of the Paleologoi, and the last of them all, Constantine, who went down into the breach and was never found. Let them go. The councils and the controversies, the sieges and the treaties and the processions, they can fade into the quiet of the night, the way the far end of that great hall softens into haze. The walls still stand in their long line. The water still runs between the continents, the way it did before Byzas came and after Mehmed went. The dome still rises above the city, and the light still comes through the ring of windows at its base each morning, exactly as the geometers intended, whoever happens to be praying beneath it. An empire kept the light of the ancient world burning for 1100 years, and then passed it on, and the world it passed it to is the one we are living in. Nothing more needs your attention. The story is told. The empire has passed, and the light is low, and the city is quiet. Sleep well.